It began with a chase across the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic, a pursuit that would become one of the most dramatic naval duels of the Second World War. It was December 1939. The war was only months old, and yet already the world was watching the oceans turn into battlefields. In those early, uncertain days, the Admiral Graf Spee, a German pocket battleship, sleek, powerful, and deadly, prowled the sea like a lone predator. Her mission was to destroy Allied merchant shipping, to cripple Britain's vital trade routes, and to vanish into the endless blue before the enemy could strike back. But this time the hunter would become the hunted. What followed was the Battle of the River Plate, a clash of courage and cunning where three outgunned British cruisers confronted a ship that outclassed them all, and where strategy, luck, and honor would shape one of the most legendary encounters in naval history. The Graf Spee had been built for a single purpose: to strike terror into the arteries of global commerce. Commissioned in 1936, and armed with 6 11-inch guns, she was faster than any battleship and more powerful than any cruiser. Her sleek design and long range made her the perfect commerce raider, a lone wolf sent to hunt the lifeblood of the British Empire. As war erupted in September 1939, she slipped quietly from Germany into the Atlantic under the command of Captain Hans Langsdorff, a disciplined officer of the Old Navy, intelligent, honorable, and deeply human. For months he stalked the shipping lanes of the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, sinking 9 merchant ships with surgical precision, while sparing their crews, rescuing survivors, and adhering to the ancient codes of naval chivalry. Yet with every sinking, the noose drew tighter. The Royal Navy, stretched across the globe, began to coordinate a massive hunt, 9 task forces converging from every corner of the ocean, all searching for one ship. By December, the Graf Spee's luck began to fade. Her supplies dwindled, her engines strained, and her position became known, near the coast of Uruguay, off the estuary of the River Plate. 3 British cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Achilles, formed a trap. Outgunned, out-armored, and outclassed, they nonetheless steamed forward to engage. At dawn on December 13th, 1939, the sea was calm and the sky pale with early light when the first shells were fired. The Graf Spee's great guns thundered across the horizon, their flashes lighting the clouds like lightning. Within minutes, the Exeter was ablaze, her decks torn open by direct hits, her bridge shattered, her guns silenced one by one. Yet the British cruisers fought on, darting in and out of range, splitting the German ship's fire, striking back with desperate precision. Smoke filled the air, shells exploded in fountains of spray. In that deadly ballet, courage mattered more than caliber. For over an hour the battle raged, a duel of endurance and willpower. Though the Graf Spee inflicted heavy damage, the relentless British attack began to tell. Ammunition was running low. Langsdorff's engines were failing. He broke off the engagement and turned toward the neutral port of Montevideo, seeking refuge to repair and refuel. The British ships, battered but unbroken, shadowed him from a distance, maintaining pressure while calling reinforcements. What followed was not just a naval battle, but a battle of wits, fought in the corridors of diplomacy, through misinformation, and in the court of world opinion. The British spread rumors that a vast fleet was assembling just beyond the horizon, battleships, carriers, and cruisers waiting to destroy the Graf Spee the moment she left harbor. In truth, no such fleet existed, but Langsdorff, believing himself surrounded, faced an impossible choice: fight and face certain death, or save his crew and surrender his honor. On December 17th, under a setting sun, and the watchful eyes of thousands gathered along the Uruguayan coast, the Admiral Graf Spee steamed slowly out of Montevideo harbor for the last time. Her crew, already disembarked, watched from afar as their ship's silhouette drifted toward the horizon. And then, an eruption of light. Flames rose into the sky as the Graf Spee's scuttling charges detonated. The mighty raider sank beneath the waves, burning with quiet dignity, her mission unfinished, but her honor intact. Captain Langsdorff, refusing to let his men die for a lost cause, had chosen self-destruction over humiliation. 3 days later, in a hotel room in Buenos Aires, dressed in full uniform and wrapped in the flag of the Imperial German Navy, he took his own life. His note was brief and solemn, an apology to his crew, his country, and to the sea itself. The sinking of the Graf Spee was more than a tactical victory. It was a moral one. For Britain, it was the first major success of the war, a symbol of defiance at a time when darkness loomed over Europe. For Germany, it was a reminder that even the finest ship and the noblest captain could not defy fate forever. The battle marked the end of the old age of chivalry at sea, a final echo of an era when honor could still exist amid the machinery of war. In the years that followed, the oceans would grow colder, darker, and more ruthless. But the story of the Graf Spee, of its courage, its tragedy, and its quiet grace, endures as one of the war's most haunting legends. Tonight we return to those southern waters, to the hunt, the smoke, and the final sunset of a ship too proud to surrender. This is the entire story of the Battle of the River Plate, the hunt for the Graf Spee, the first great naval drama of the Second World War, and the moment when duty, deception, and destiny met upon the open sea. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The South Atlantic stretched wide and unbroken, a vast mirror of water where the horizon blurred into the sky. Merchant ships moved carefully across its surface, carrying food, fuel, and hope across long routes that connected continents. Their decks were simple places of work, alive with footsteps, voices, and the rhythm of waves against steel. Sailors rose with the dawn and turned in with the stars, guided by constellations that had steered men for centuries. To them the sea was both friend and threat, a highway that promised distance, and a wilderness that could never be mastered. The air smelled of salt and oil, and nights brought a stillness that felt endless. Beyond the thin walls of each vessel, there was only water, heavy and unknowable. Yet despite the calm, whispers of danger had begun to follow them, like wind carrying a rumor across the decks. For in these waters, war had already arrived, though it did not always show its face. The ocean was beautiful, but beneath its shimmer unease was slowly rising. The merchant convoys often traveled alone in these early months of war, spread out across an ocean too wide to protect in full. Each captain watched the horizon with quiet caution, knowing that somewhere out there, hunters could be waiting. Cargo holds were heavy with wheat, steel, and sometimes troops. But the greatest weight was the thought of being found. Men would lean over railings at night, staring into blackness that could conceal anything, listening to the faint hum of engines beneath their feet. In the daylight, the sea looked harmless, but the emptiness itself carried tension. The radio was their lifeline, its static often more unnerving than silence. Reports filtered through in broken code, hints of ships vanishing, vessels burning, survivors adrift. The sailors did not always know the details, but they felt the edge of the truth, carried by rumor and waiting. The South Atlantic was no longer just water. It was becoming a chessboard where unseen pieces were already moving. Each day at sea felt ordinary, yet every day held the chance of change. Far from the crowded centers of Europe, the war at sea began quietly here, in stretches of water where land could not be seen. To the men on merchant ships, the conflict felt both distant and near, like a storm on the horizon whose winds had not yet arrived. They sailed under bright skies and calm mornings, but the war was already shaping their routes, their schedules, and their nerves. Somewhere beyond the horizon, powerful ships moved like shadows, slipping between shipping lanes, hunting without being seen. The sailors often wondered what kind of men commanded such vessels, what thoughts guided them as they plotted courses across this open expanse. They imagined eyes watching them, measuring distance, weighing decisions. Though they could not see it, they were not alone on these waters, and each mile carried its own question mark. Quiet tension crept into even the most routine tasks, like checking bearings or polishing brass. For the ocean, which once had seemed infinite and free, was slowly becoming a battlefield, and though it was still calm, calmness itself began to feel fragile. The South Atlantic had its own rhythm, one of winds, tides, and vast weather systems that could change with little warning. Storms gathered in sudden darkness, then cleared to reveal skies of astonishing clarity, leaving sailors humbled by the scale beneath them. The deep was colder and darker than they could ever imagine. Home to currents that had moved for millennia, on the surface, seabirds circled and fish leapt, life continuing its endless cycle, despite the growing shadow of war. To many sailors, it felt as if the sea itself did not care who won or lost. It carried ships with equal indifference, offering shelter and threat alike. This neutrality gave the ocean a strange power, as though it was a stage where men might act, but not control the play itself. Every sound seemed amplified in this stillness: the strike of a bell, the thrum of engines, the whistle of wind across open decks. Time stretched differently out here, hours flowing together, days marked only by duty and rest. Yet behind every simple detail, there lingered the knowledge that peace was fragile, and it was this fragility that gave the calm its haunting quality. In European capitals, leaders spoke of strategy and alliances, but on these waters, the war was felt in subtler ways. A ship missing from a convoy, a sudden silence on the radio, or a signal flag raised in warning could tell sailors more than any speech. The ocean carried news slowly, and by the time it reached them, it often came wrapped in mystery and uncertainty. Yet the sailors understood enough. There were German raiders on the loose, and one of them was like no other. This vessel was not large enough to be a battleship, yet stronger than most cruisers, designed to chase and escape with equal skill. The very idea of her created unease, for she seemed both hunter and ghost to the British, French, and Allied crews who listened for her name. She was both a challenge and a threat. Every rumor of her movements made men check their charts and scan their horizons with renewed care. Even those who had never seen her knew she was out there, somewhere. The ocean carried her reputation like a silent tide. The merchant ships, though often unarmed or lightly protected, continued their journeys because they had to. Nations depended on their cargoes, and the war effort could not wait for safety to be assured. For many sailors, duty was stronger than fear, though fear never fully left them. They watched the sea at dawn and dusk, the times when light blurred and visibility was most uncertain. They spoke in quiet tones about the dangers, sometimes disguising worry with humor, sometimes holding silence instead. Each voyage felt like a test of patience, courage, and luck. And while most days passed uneventfully, the knowledge of risk gave every moment weight. They could never quite escape the thought that somewhere beyond sight, a shape was moving toward them. This thought was rarely spoken aloud, yet it lingered in every look toward the horizon, and in that horizon, stories of shadows began to take form. Naval intelligence worked tirelessly to track the movements of Germany's pocket battleships, but information came in fragments, never in full. Reports crossed oceans, coded, delayed, and sometimes contradictory, leaving commanders to guess more than they knew. To sailors at sea, the enemy felt less like a ship and more like an invisible presence, sometimes everywhere, sometimes nowhere. It was this uncertainty that wore on them, more than any storm or long shift at the helm. The idea of a hunter who struck and vanished weighed on their imaginations like a dark cloud across clear water. Yet life continued with its routines, polishing brass, preparing meals, keeping watch, even as unease remained beneath the surface. The war had made their ocean both familiar and unfamiliar, the same waters yet somehow changed. In this quiet shift, the men began to feel that history itself was brushing against their lives. They did not know when or where, but they sensed that a great meeting was approaching, and it was in this quiet before the storm that the ocean seemed to whisper. The South Atlantic was vast, but not infinite, and in its immensity two paths were slowly converging. One belonged to the merchant ships, steady and vulnerable, carrying the weight of a war effort across seas. The other belonged to a vessel that bore the name Admiral Graf Spee, Germany's most elusive pocket battleship. She moved like a shadow across the waves, guided by orders from far away, but carried by the will of her captain. To some she was a marvel of engineering, sleek and powerful. To others she was a ghost, appearing only in the wreckage she left behind. The ocean knew both truths, carrying her calmly as it carried all ships, indifferent to the struggle upon its surface. Yet for the men who sailed under her threat, she was more than steel, she was the shape of danger itself. This was the quiet truth of the early months of the war at sea, where fear spread in whispers before any cannon fired. The ocean held its breath, as if waiting for something, but beneath the gentle waves, a hunter was already moving, a shadow named Graf Spee. The story of the Admiral Graf Spee began not in the South Atlantic, but in the shipyards of Germany, where steel was bent into lines of elegance and power. She belonged to a new category, one that blurred the familiar definitions of cruiser and battleship. Officially she was called a panzerschiff, or armored ship, but most came to know her as a pocket battleship. She carried 6 11-inch guns, weapons heavy enough to threaten larger foes, yet she was built with speed to outpace those she could not outfight. Her hull was sleek, balanced between strength and swiftness, a shape born of compromise, but also of ambition. On her decks, sailors walked with quiet pride, aware they served on a vessel whispered about, even before she set to sea. She was less imposing than the true giants of the Navy, yet more dangerous than most who might cross her path. Engineers had crafted her to be versatile, a hunter that could vanish if cornered, and strike if opportunity appeared. Her very design carried within it the tension of both fragility and menace, and so even at rest, she seemed a paradox in steel. The name she carried was no accident, for she bore the memory of Admiral Maximilian von Spee, who had fallen at the Battle of the Falklands in the First World War. His defeat had been swift, yet his honor was remembered, and now his name sailed again on a vessel of new power. To those who served aboard, it was a name that carried both pride and burden. They spoke of the Admiral with respect, recalling his dignity in loss and his legacy of courage. In this way, Graf Spee was more than just a machine, she was a symbol of remembrance and resolve. Sailors polished brass, and checked bearings beneath banners that bore his name. Each task carried out with a sense of lineage, for in navies names are more than words, they are traditions, living echoes of those who have gone before. And so the crew felt not only their own duty, but also the weight of a story that had begun long before them. It gave their vessel a soul, or so they believed, carried in every journey she made, and this soul, like the steel of her frame, was destined to be tested. The men who crewed Graf Spee were not unlike those who sailed on any navy's ships, though their routines carried the precision of German discipline. They rose with the dawn, carried out drills, and worked in ordered rhythms that turned the ship into a living organism. In the engine rooms, heat pressed against their skin as machinery thundered, while on the bridge, cool winds met the officers who watched horizons. Between those extremes, the life of the ship unfolded, with meals served, jokes told, and songs hummed quietly at night. Yet always behind the ordinary beat of life was the awareness of their mission. They were not sailing for leisure or training, but for the dangerous work of striking at enemy trade. Each man knew his role in this purpose, from the lookout with sharp eyes to the gunnery officer who calculated distances with calm care. Their presence turned the ship from steel into will, from potential into movement, and though war had barely begun, they sensed already that their place in it would not be small. The weight of destiny was felt not in shouts, but in silence. Designers had envisioned her role with clarity to roam the sea lanes, far from Europe, and disrupt the lifelines of Britain's empire. She was to be one part predator, one part phantom, feared not because of what she destroyed, but because she could appear anywhere. In these oceans, geography was her ally, for the distances were vast and patrols too few. The British Navy was strong, but its reach was stretched thin across oceans that circled the globe. Graf Spee was meant to exploit that weakness, striking with suddenness, then retreating into distance. Her strength lay not in holding territory, but in denying security, turning open water into contested space. To those who faced her, the fear was not only of her guns, but of her unpredictability. She embodied the war at sea in its most elusive form, a shifting shape against an endless horizon. The strategy was elegant, yet it carried risks as deep as the waters she sailed, for in chasing shadows, one could just as easily become one. The sailors who served her often felt the paradox of their existence. Their ship was powerful, yet she could not stand against an enemy fleet. They trained with efficiency, drilling for battle, but they knew that their greatest weapon was escape. To strike and run required nerves of steel and trust in their captain's judgment. Each decision at sea mattered, each mile plotted carefully, for a mistake could place them before superior forces. This sharpened their sense of purpose, making every voyage one of tension wrapped in calm routine. When they gathered at meals, laughter might soften the edges, but no one fully forgot the risks. The engines hummed beneath their feet, and the horizon always seemed to hold secrets. Yet pride remained, for they were part of something daring, a mission that reached far beyond the safety of ports. It was this pride that steadied them in uncertain hours, reminding them of why they sailed so far from home. And in this balance between danger and duty, Graf Spee's crew found their strength. Captain Hans Langsdorff stood at the center of this vessel's life, a man whose leadership was calm, thoughtful, and deeply tied to honor. He was respected not for loudness or severity, but for his steadiness, the kind that men trusted in long voyages. To his crew, he was both distant in authority and close in understanding, a figure who carried their burdens as much as his own. He believed in restraint, in fighting with discipline rather than cruelty, and this belief would mark every action taken by his ship. His eyes often lingered on the horizon, as though weighing not just distance but destiny itself. Those who spoke of him recalled his quiet voice, his measured steps, and the sense that he carried history on his shoulders. In him the paradox of Graf Spee was reflected again: strength tempered by caution, duty shaped by conscience. He knew the dangers of their mission, yet he accepted them with clarity, guiding his men with a steady hand. Under his watch, the ship felt less like a machine of war, and more like a community bound by respect. And in this unity, Graf Spee's true power was formed. Life aboard Graf Spee was not always filled with tension, for sailors found moments of simplicity amid their duty. They smoked on deck beneath stars that seemed brighter at sea. They played cards in the warmth below. They wrote letters home that might take months to arrive. The hum of engines became background music to their lives, a sound both steadying and unchanging. Food was shared, stories were told, and friendships were made across narrow bunks and long watches. These human moments softened the edges of war, reminding the men that they were more than sailors. They were fathers, sons, and friends. Yet every sound of the sea beyond the hull carried with it a reminder that this calm was temporary. Duty always returned. Drills sounded, and the thought of the enemy never vanished. The sea was both their refuge and their testing ground, offering beauty and danger in equal measure. And in this rhythm of ordinary life and looming purpose, the days passed like waves rolling endlessly onward. By the time Graf Spee left her harbours for distant seas, she carried more than weapons and men. She carried the hopes of a strategy designed to unsettle the balance of the war. She carried the pride of a navy seeking redemption from past losses, and she carried the quiet determination of her crew, bound together by ship and name. In the distance lay oceans filled with merchant ships, routes that connected worlds, and opportunities for both victory and peril. Her lines cut through the water with grace, her engines carried her swiftly, and her guns waited in silence. To those who saw her depart, she seemed both beautiful and ominous. Like a shadow stretched across the morning, she was not built to conquer cities or seize land, but to shape the sea itself through fear and disruption. Her mission was not conquest of land, but mastery of sea lanes, and soon she would begin to stalk her prey. Graf Spee moved across the South Atlantic with a quiet grace, a hunter whose presence was known more by rumor than by sight. She did not thunder through the waves, but slipped along them, her engine steady and her course carefully chosen to those aboard. It felt like a voyage guided less by maps than by instinct, as though the ocean itself whispered where the prey might be found. Merchant ships moved on their own paths, unaware that their fates sometimes intersected with hers. The encounters were sudden but strangely measured, not battles of chaos, but exercises in precision. Graf Spee would appear on the horizon, a shape that could not be mistaken, and her orders were delivered firmly yet without cruelty. Cargoes were seized, crews gathered, and ships disabled so they could no longer carry their burdens forward. And yet, most of the time lives were spared, for Langsdorff believed in restraint, even when duty pressed him otherwise. The ocean became a chessboard of captures and releases, of tension without full destruction. In these waters, silence was both weapon and warning. To the sailors of merchant ships, the first sight of Graf Spee was both terrifying and surreal. She rose from the horizon, like a shadow made of steel, too large to ignore and too close to resist. Yet, instead of sudden fire, there was often an order to stop, a signal flag raised, or a shot placed carefully as a warning. Crews were gathered quickly, their ships searched with efficiency, and then decisions were made that felt almost ritualistic. Sometimes cargoes were confiscated, sometimes ships were scuttled. Their usefulness ended in a controlled quiet. The men found themselves taken aboard as prisoners, but treated with a form of courtesy that seemed unexpected in wartime. Meals were shared, wounds tended, and words exchanged in cautious tones between men who had once been enemies, only in name. These encounters left a strange memory, one of both fear and relief, where death had been close but had stepped aside. The sea carried those memories onward, whispered from ship to ship, as stories retold in hushed voices. And so Graf Spee's legend spread not only through her actions, but through the words of those who survived her. Langsdorff's approach to commerce raiding was marked by discipline, shaped by both his conscience and the laws of the sea. He did not see his mission as one of cruelty, but of disruption, a strategy to weaken Britain without unnecessary bloodshed. He followed the codes that sailors had once honored, ensuring that non-combatants were not left to perish in open waters. This was not always simple, for the war demanded results, and time pressed against him like a constant tide. Yet he carried out his duties with a measured hand, choosing to fight the war in a way that aligned with his sense of honor. Prisoners were kept aboard in cramped quarters, yet they were given food, space to breathe, and dignity. These choices shaped how Graf Spee was remembered, less as a terror of the sea, and more as a relentless but restrained predator. The British still feared her, for she struck at their lifelines, but even they noted the strange balance of ruthlessness and mercy. It was as though the ship herself carried two faces, one of steel and one of humanity. And in that duality lay the mystery of her hunt. For the Allied sailors who survived encounters with Graf Spee, the memory often lingered like a dream from which they had awoken too suddenly. They recalled standing on their own decks, staring at her guns, knowing that resistance was impossible. They remembered being gathered under watchful eyes, waiting for decisions that held their futures in balance, and they remembered the moments of release or captivity, the sudden change from freedom to uncertainty. To them she became less a ship and more a symbol, a reminder of how fragile their voyages had become. Conversations at night would return again and again to the same questions. Where was she now, and when would she appear again? These questions filled the silence between duties, carried on the winds of every convoy. Even ships that never saw her felt her presence, as though her shadow stretched across the ocean. It was the fear of the unseen, the weight of possibility, that made her so effective, and thus Graf Spee became not only a raider, but a phantom. The ocean itself seemed to aid her in this role, for its vastness was her greatest ally. She slipped between patrols, vanished into horizons, and emerged where she was least expected. The sea was wide enough to hide her, yet narrow enough to carry whispers of her passing. Every report of a sinking sent ripples through shipping routes, forcing convoys to change course, slow speed, or call for escorts. It was a battle fought less with shells and more with uncertainty, as every delay weakened the lifelines that Britain depended upon. The Germans called it commerce raiding, but the sailors who faced it called it something more personal, a shadow at their backs. Graf Spee was never everywhere, yet she felt like she could be anywhere, and that fear alone was powerful. In the stillness of the night watches, men stared into the dark, wondering if her silhouette was hidden there, and in those long watchful hours, fear became as heavy as steel. For the crew of Graf Spee, each encounter was both routine and momentous, another step in their mission, but also another mark upon their conscience. They grew used to the suddenness of the chase, the procedures of capture, the careful handling of those placed in their care. Yet even as the tasks repeated, the weight of their journey grew heavier, for the ocean never let them forget that each decision carried consequence. Prisoners crowded their spaces, supplies stretched thin, and the balance between mercy and efficiency grew harder to hold. Still they carried on with discipline, their days marked by drills, their nights by the hum of engines and the watch of stars. Some spoke little, holding their thoughts close, while others whispered about the strange fairness of their mission. In those whispers, doubt and pride mixed uneasily, for they knew their task was unlike the brutal wars being fought elsewhere. Their ship was feared, but it was also oddly respected, even by some who opposed them, and this sense of contradiction became a part of the rhythm of their days. As weeks passed, the ocean seemed to grow smaller, not in distance, but in tension. Allied navies gathered reports, plotted movements, and began to tighten their watch. Merchant ships changed routes, convoys grew larger, and the hunt for Graf Spee took shape in the silence of coded messages. Yet for a time she still moved freely, continuing her strange campaign of striking and sparing, disrupting and vanishing. Each new capture deepened her legend, and each spared crew spread the story further. To the Allies, she was a thorn in their supply lines, but to many sailors, she was a riddle, dangerous yet strangely human. The South Atlantic, once vast and indifferent, now felt alive with pursuit and response. It was as if the waters themselves carried tension, each wave pushing events toward an inevitable meeting. And in this growing unease, the seeds of her fate were already being sown, for even shadows cannot remain hidden forever. The silence that Graf Spee created across the ocean was powerful, but it could not last. Each ship she stopped left behind a trail of knowledge, fragments of information that slowly formed a pattern. The Allies began to read this pattern, charting her movements, narrowing her choices with each passing day. What had once been an ocean of endless hiding places became gradually smaller as the net of pursuit drew tighter. Sailors aboard convoys felt it too. A change in the air, a sense that the game of shadow and silence was nearing its climax. Graf Spee had played her role with discipline and efficiency. But the ocean was never truly endless. Whispers turned to reports and reports to strategies, until her course could no longer remain secret. She had been a ghost, but even ghosts leave footprints in the sand. And so the calm of her hunt began to shift toward confrontation. Yet the Atlantic could not stay silent forever. Word of the hunter spread, and so did the hunt for her. The silence that had cloaked Graf Spee could not remain unbroken forever, for the world beyond her steel decks was beginning to stir. The British Admiralty had listened carefully to every report, every fragment of testimony carried by survivors of her raids. Ships scuttled or captured left behind whispers of time, position, and heading, threads that, when woven together, began to form a tapestry of her journey to London. The South Atlantic was no longer an endless expanse, but a chessboard upon which a single powerful piece moved with dangerous precision. The Allies knew that to guard every square was impossible, but to direct their hunters toward key crossings and routes was both possible and necessary. And so convoys were gathered more tightly, their escort strengthened, and hunting groups dispatched like watchful sentinels. These groups were not scattered at random, but carefully positioned to sweep across the ocean's lifelines, where Graf Spee might next appear. Each order carried with it the weight of urgency, for every ship spared was a victory, and every ship lost was a wound. Slowly the vast ocean began to close upon her, turning silence into a pattern of pursuit. And with each passing day, the distance between hunter and hunted grew smaller. The hunting groups themselves were made of varied strength, drawn from what the Royal Navy could gather in those first uneasy months of war. Some were built around old cruisers, their speed still useful, though their age showed in their lines. Others centered upon aircraft carriers, small but determined, whose planes could stretch their reach far beyond the horizon. Still others were task forces of destroyers and light cruisers, swift and watchful, their orders to chase and harry rather than to stand alone. These groups were scattered across the ocean, linked by signals and shared intent, like pieces of a great net cast into moving waters. The men aboard them knew their mission was not only to protect the lifelines of Britain, but to bring an end to the growing legend of Graf Spee. They watched the waves with patience, scanning for shadows that might betray her course. In their silence lay a readiness, for they knew the confrontation would come not suddenly, but inevitably. The ocean had once seemed to hide her completely, but now it felt smaller, as though boundaries were closing in, and within those narrowing horizons, destiny began to take shape. For the British, every rumour of Graf Spee was both burden and opportunity, each uncertain report another piece in the puzzle of her whereabouts. The Admiralty sifted through messages, calculating courses and estimating days, knowing that a single error could mean a ship lost. Yet as the evidence grew, a pattern emerged, one that suggested her path was not random but carefully chosen. She struck where she could hurt Britain most, where shipping was plentiful yet lightly guarded. That very logic allowed the Allies to predict her, to send their hunting groups to places she would likely return. It was a battle not only of guns but of minds, fought across charts and maps, long before any shells were fired. The Admiralty's patience was a weapon in itself, for time worked against a ship that must eventually take risks to fulfill her mission. And as Graf Spee pressed forward, the hunters pressed closer, unseen but persistent. The game of shadow and silence was giving way to one of pursuit and encounter. To the merchant sailors, this unseen tightening of the net was felt not in reports or maps, but in the growing presence of escorts, where once they had crossed lonely seas with only hope as their defense, now cruisers and destroyers often moved among them. Their decks felt safer under the watchful eyes of guns, even as they knew no safety could be absolute. The mood shifted slowly, from one of fear without defense to one of wary expectation. The tales of Graf Spee still spread, but so too did the stories of Allied ships sailing outward to find her. In the long evenings, sailors spoke of the balance changing, of the ocean no longer belonging only to the hunter. These were not certainties, but hopes fragile and quiet, like lanterns against the night. Still, they carried meaning, for hope itself is a form of strength, and strength is what the sea demanded. For in the end it was not only ships that were tested, but the endurance of those who sailed them. And within this endurance, the pursuit of Graf Spee gathered its quiet momentum. To Langsdorff and his crew, the signs of the tightening net were subtle but unmistakable. Radio reports grew more frequent, merchant routes became better guarded, and the presence of Allied warships was felt even before it was seen. The wide ocean no longer felt empty, but alive with the unseen movements of others. Each capture became more complicated, each decision weighed against the risk of exposure. Still, the captain held his course, guided by duty and by the necessity of his mission. He spoke with calm, even as the horizon seemed less welcoming than before, his words steady, to preserve the morale of his men. Yet, in the quiet spaces between orders, the crew too could sense that their freedom of movement was diminishing. They carried themselves with discipline, but discipline does not erase awareness, nor silence the thoughts that linger at night. And so aboard Graf Spee, the weight of pursuit became another presence at sea, invisible but always near. Across the Atlantic, the story of pursuit grew not through battles fought, but through anticipation itself. Each Allied warship that sailed in search of Graf Spee carried within it the patience of men waiting for a storm they knew would come. Days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of the sea measured in watches and log entries, yet beneath it all was a steady current of expectation. They knew that every sunrise might be the one to reveal her silhouette, that every cloud break might uncover her form upon the horizon. This patience was its own kind of endurance, as vital as ammunition or coal. The Royal Navy had long been trained in such endurance, knowing that oceans are not conquered in haste but in persistence. The hunt was as much about waiting as it was about fighting, and the longer it stretched, the more certain the hunters became of their prey, for silence cannot protect forever, and shadows always meet the dawn. Each day that passed tightened the invisible line around her, and within that tightening line lay the certainty that the chase would end. The net itself was vast, composed of warships from many ports, each one a piece of a larger design, from Freetown to Cape Town, from the River Plate to the waters near Brazil. Ships patrolled with steady vigilance. The network grew stronger with each new report, narrowing the seas where Graf Spee could move undetected. It was a slow, deliberate tightening, not a sudden trap, but one woven through patience and calculation. The Allied command accepted that losses might still come, but each loss brought the hunters closer, each sinking a signpost pointing the way. In this way, the ocean itself became a labyrinth, its open expanses closing into channels of risk, and Graf Spee, for all her speed and power, found herself caught within this labyrinth. The irony was clear. The ocean that once gave her freedom now conspired to limit her. Yet even in this narrowing maze, the hunter still held power, and danger still lived within her guns. For the end of the hunt was near but not yet written. The ocean, which had carried whispers of Graf Spee's hunt, now carried whispers of her hunters as well. Merchant sailors spoke of cruisers and carriers moving into position, of warships steaming quietly through the night. The tension in the air was no longer one-sided, for fear now travelled in both directions. Graf Spee was still feared, but so too was the thought that she might be found and challenged. The balance was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, like a tide rolling toward shore. The South Atlantic was no longer her stage alone. It had become a gathering place of hunters and hunted alike. Each horizon promised more than silence, for beyond it might lie pursuit or confrontation. The ocean's calm held within it the weight of waiting, a stillness heavy with the promise of what was to come. And in that stillness the chase reached a quiet intensity that no words could soften. And among those hunters, 3 would find themselves placed directly in her path. The Royal Navy moved quietly, but with purpose, across the South Atlantic, sending cruisers to meet the threat of Graf Spee. Among these ships were Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles, each with its own personality, history, and crew. Exeter, larger and heavier, carried guns that could reach far across the water. Her decks lined with sailors who knew discipline as a second skin. Ajax and Achilles, faster and lighter, relied on speed and agility, their officers skilled in maneuvering across uncertain seas. The men aboard all 3 carried the same quiet resolve, a calm energy that belied their awareness of the hunter they sought. Each ship was a microcosm of routine and focus, with sailors moving in rhythms shaped by drill, meals, and watch. Nights were spent scanning the horizon, listening to the wind, and noting the subtle shifts of light on the water. In their cabins, officers traced charts with careful fingers, imagining lines of pursuit across empty expanses. Though distant from the cities that had sent them, the weight of responsibility was palpable in every step on deck. And in this slow, deliberate preparation, the stage for confrontation began to take form. Exeter's crew had long been seasoned in the quiet rigors of patrolling, their work a steady heartbeat of the ship's life. They polished brass, maintained engines, and ran drills with meticulous care, each action reinforcing a sense of readiness. Officers and ratings alike moved through the decks with attention, their eyes scanning both water and sky for signs of movement. The ship carried an air of authority, a presence that spoke without noise, asserting itself through measured motion rather than gesture. Below decks, men shared meals, exchanged letters, and whispered of loved ones far away. Even in moments of calm, there was a tension, a sense that they were moving toward something inevitable. Yet the discipline of routine created comfort, a rhythm that steadied nerves and minds alike. Each watch at the helm became a meditation in vigilance, each hour a quiet test of patience, and slowly the crew's confidence in their ship and each other grew, like roots stretching through familiar soil. For Exeter the ocean was both challenge and companion. Ajax moved differently, lighter upon the waves, almost as if the sea itself carried her with ease. Her engines hummed in smooth unison, echoing the steady pulse of her crew, who moved with alertness, sharpened by experience. Officers traced courses across the charts, their eyes scanning distances and angles, as if the lines themselves might whisper secrets. Sailors leaned over rails at dawn, watching horizons that promised possibility and risk in equal measure. Her guns were smaller, yet precise, tools of restraint as much as power. The rhythm of drills and maintenance was both calming and purposeful, shaping life aboard with subtle certainty. Even in open water, the crew felt a connection to the wider naval effort, a sense that their actions mattered beyond their decks. Night brought long watches, the stars above serving as silent companions, as thoughts drifted across the Atlantic. And in Ajax's steady movement, there was a sense of quiet anticipation, as if the ship itself knew that her path was converging with destiny. The sea carried her forward, patient and measured. Achilles, though similar in design to Ajax, held her own character in the minds of those aboard. Lively and responsive, she cut across the waves with an energy that reflected the spirit of her crew. Officers moved quickly but calmly, issuing orders that rippled through the ship with understated precision. Sailors climbed rigging, polished rails, and adjusted equipment with careful hands. Each action a note in a quiet symphony of preparation. Conversations in the mess were low, filled with the soft cadence of familiarity and routine. The ocean around her seemed to stretch wide and open, yet within it lay the tension of uncertainty, the knowledge that a shadow might be waiting beyond the horizon. Even in daylight, the water could be deceptive, waves rolling gently, as if masking the calculations of fate beneath. Each mile traveled was both ordinary and charged, the calm punctuated by the silent presence of purpose. And in Achilles' wake, the Atlantic seemed to carry a subtle promise that movement and preparation were leading somewhere inevitable. Her course, like that of her sisters, was quietly but steadily drawn toward confrontation. Each cruiser carried a crew who knew both comfort and vigilance, the interplay between safety in routine and awareness of threat. Men shared small rituals, smoking on deck, swapping stories, checking instruments, that created familiarity in a world defined by uncertainty. In the night watches, eyes swept horizons with patience, scanning light and shadow for anything unusual. Even in quiet moments, minds traced the movements of Graf Spee, imagining her steel silhouette cutting across distant waves. The ocean itself seemed to respond, carrying sound and shadow, wind and tide, in ways that could be measured only by careful attention. Ships and crew alike moved in concert, each contributing to a silent orchestration of readiness. Communication between cruisers was measured, deliberate, carried by signals and codes that only a few understood, and in this choreography of human and steel, the sense of inevitable meeting grew stronger. Each ship was both alone and part of a network, a pulse in a larger heartbeat, stretching across the Atlantic. The horizon, endless yet defined, held both challenge and promise. The differences between Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles shaped their roles as much as their guns and speed. Exeter would bear the brunt of any engagement, her heavier guns a reminder of authority and presence. Ajax and Achilles flanked, ready to intercept, maneuver, and respond with swiftness. Their movements were coordinated with quiet understanding, a subtle interplay of distance, timing, and anticipation. Officers calculated ranges and courses with care, knowing that a single misstep could ripple across hours of preparation. Below decks, sailors continued their quiet routines, unaware of the calculations that would soon touch their lives. Yet the calm on deck belied an awareness that everything had a purpose, that each mile traveled brought them closer to an encounter long awaited. And in this unity of intention, the cruisers became more than steel. They became the embodiment of resolve and patience. Across miles of water, the invisible lines of strategy stretched between them, and in those lines the story of the hunt drew nearer. As the South Atlantic shifted from night to dawn, the cruisers carried themselves with a measured anticipation. The light softened on waves that seemed to stretch forever, the horizon blending sky and sea into gentle gradients of color. Sailors adjusted sails and lines, polished brass, and checked instruments with attention that was calm yet precise. Officers leaned over charts, tracing paths and imagining the presence of Graf Spee somewhere just beyond sight. Every detail mattered, for the ocean allowed no carelessness, and the hunter they pursued was both skilled and relentless. Yet even in the quiet tension there was a sense of purpose, a rhythm that lent comfort to those who followed it. Ships moved steadily, their wakes forming trails of gentle white upon deep water. And in this movement, the Atlantic carried whispers of the inevitable, of convergence and confrontation. Calm and focus, speed and steel, all converged into a single silent preparation. The hunt was closing, and the three cruisers sailed as one against the approaching shadow. The Atlantic stretched vast, yet the paths of hunter and hunters were gradually drawn together. Each cruiser, steady in her routine, felt the weight of responsibility as both guardian and pursuer. The ocean itself seemed to pulse beneath them, a slow, unspoken rhythm that carried stories of distant ports, lost cargoes, and quiet resolve. Sailors felt it in the sway of the decks, in the cool wind against their faces, and in the hush of long night watches. Ships traced invisible lines upon the water, each calculated to intercept, to converge, to hold steady in preparation. The history of steel, water, and duty coalesced into a quiet energy that flowed through men and machines alike. And though no shots had yet been fired, destiny began to draw the boundaries within which they would meet. The Atlantic, once endless and indifferent, was becoming a place of measured expectation, and in their shadows, destiny was drawing lines across the sea, leading to the mouth of the River Plate. The morning of December 13th, 1939, began quietly over the South Atlantic, with the horizon stretching unbroken and calm. Gentle waves rippled under the soft glow of the rising sun, their surfaces catching light that shimmered like scattered diamonds. Sailors aboard Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles moved through their morning routines with quiet efficiency, checking instruments, adjusting sails, and noting subtle changes in wind and tide. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint tang of salt and distance. Nothing suggested that this ordinary sunrise would become the stage for one of the war's early confrontations. The sea held its breath, carrying a promise of movement while remaining patient and unyielding. Officers traced courses across charts, their fingers lingering on points that would soon hold great significance. Every glance toward the horizon was a meditation in expectation, an acknowledgement of the invisible threads that connected hunter and hunted. In this calm, every sound, every shadow seemed amplified and meaningful, and yet, far beyond sight, Graf Spee was already closing the distance, a silent presence carried by wind and water. Below decks, sailors moved with deliberate care, the rhythm of routine grounding them in the moment. Breakfast was prepared, hammocks were adjusted, and engines were monitored with steady attention. Conversations were low, punctuated by the occasional laughter or comment, carrying a sense of normality that belied the tension in the air. The Atlantic stretched endlessly, a canvas of silver and blue that promised both serenity and surprise. Even as the men attended to their tasks, they felt an unspoken awareness that something awaited them beyond the horizon. The officers whispered quietly among themselves, exchanging updates on potential sightings and invisible movements of the sea. Their calm was deliberate, a necessary counterbalance to the anticipation that hummed faintly beneath it. Every routine act became a silent preparation, a small measure against the unpredictability of the ocean. And as waves lapped gently against hulls, the rhythm of life aboard continued undisturbed. The day held a quiet, deliberate patience, unaware that the hunter approached steadily. On deck, the sunlight fell soft upon the steel, casting long, pale shadows across the rails and gun turrets. Sailors adjusted lookout positions, eyes sweeping the distant horizon with measured diligence. The gentle wind teased hair and clothing, carrying the sounds of creaking ropes and the distant lapping of water. Each cruiser seemed to breathe slowly, engines thrumming with a low, constant rhythm, harmonizing with the sea itself. Even the gulls above moved with calm purpose, dipping and gliding, as though aware of the quiet tension below. Men traced the line of the horizon repeatedly, noting subtle changes in light, distance, and shadow. The sea and sky held secrets, offering both comfort and forewarning to those who knew how to read them. Officers recorded positions meticulously, aware that their decisions might soon determine the course of history. Every sound, from a rope sliding to a footstep on metal, became part of a shared rhythm of readiness. And still, Graf Spee drew closer, silent and deliberate, across miles of reflective water. In the quiet of early morning, the British crews imagined the vastness of the ocean, unaware of how narrow their paths were becoming. Each ship's course seemed solitary, yet in reality they were part of an invisible web stretching across currents and winds. The men felt calm, trusting in routine and training, unaware that the hunter's shadow was approaching from beyond sight. Thoughts drifted to home, to distant harbors and letters, while the sea offered a gentle lull and steady cadence. Officers consulted charts with quiet fingers, adjusting predictions, noting subtle possibilities, and tracing lines that would soon intersect with destiny. Every detail mattered: the speed of the current, the angle of the sunlight, the pattern of distant clouds. Sailors shared small words and gestures, a connection that made the vast ocean feel less lonely. The rhythm of the deck, the whisper of wind, and the low hum of engines created a meditative harmony. And as they scanned the horizon, they felt a calm that was also a form of readiness. The Atlantic seemed infinite, yet it was closing imperceptibly around them. Above, the sky shifted from pale silver to gold, each cloud outlined in the soft warmth of dawn. Light played across waves, turning them into gentle ripples that reflected both sun and shadow. The horizon was distant, almost timeless, stretching into a subtle haze where sea and sky touched. Every sailor noted the tranquility, sensing that it held both reassurance and tension, a quiet prelude to events yet unseen. Officers whispered course corrections, plotting minor adjustments that would soon be critical in the encounter ahead. The gentle wind carried both moisture and a distant sense of movement, as though the ocean itself hinted at what approached. Even the birds seemed still, circling in patterns that mirrored the calm and patience below. The steel of the cruisers absorbed the light, reflecting it softly across decks and rails, and in that reflective calm anticipation grew imperceptibly, like a tide gathering beneath the surface. The morning held a slow, deliberate heartbeat, waiting for the moment it would be measured against steel and strategy. Sailors moved from deck to deck, performing small tasks that seemed ordinary yet held subtle importance. Ropes were secured, instruments checked, and periscopes adjusted, each action reinforcing readiness while preserving routine. The hum of engines was steady, a gentle undercurrent to the faint calls and laughter that punctuated the air. Officers traced distances, recalculated courses, and marked points on charts that would soon hold lasting significance. Below, the messes and cabins were alive with quiet conversation, letters read, meals shared, and small gestures of camaraderie. Above, the Atlantic stretched wide, carrying a sense of serenity that was both comforting and deceptive. Every sailor felt the rhythm of the sea, a pulse that guided movement and perception alike. They moved in tandem with the invisible patterns of the ocean, unaware that their steps aligned with those of an approaching hunter. The calm of the morning was both a blessing and a test, a slow tension carried upon light waves, and with each passing minute, Graf Spee drew quietly, deliberately closer. As the sun climbed, the Atlantic seemed to stretch endlessly, holding both the promise of calm and the inevitability of change. Light reflected in subtle gradients across waves, turning the horizon into a living painting of silver, blue, and gold. Sailors watched with measured eyes, their gazes following invisible lines across the water where movements might occur. The engines beneath their feet thrummed with quiet consistency, grounding them in a rhythm that both calmed and prepared. Officers whispered calculations, considering speed, distance, and the faintest signs of distant shapes. Even the gentlest breeze carried meaning, shifting flags, teasing ropes, and carrying sounds that might foretell movement. The ocean seemed vast, yet in that vastness, the boundaries of fate were tightening imperceptibly. Every step taken, every glance at the horizon, moved them forward along paths that destiny had begun to draw. And in this delicate, slow crescendo, the tension of waiting filled the space between waves and sky, and as the sun rose, so too did the clash of steel and fire. The stillness of the morning was broken suddenly by a distant, low thunder, a sound that rippled across the calm waters like a distant storm. Sailors froze mid-step, eyes straining toward the horizon, where shapes emerged with an almost surreal clarity. Graf Spee revealed herself with deliberate power, her steel hull reflecting the early sunlight, her guns poised with quiet menace. Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles responded in kind, their crews steady despite the abrupt shift from anticipation to action. The ocean, once calm and forgiving, now seemed to carry energy in every wave, every ripple intensified by the tension of human intent. Orders were exchanged in measured tones, each word deliberate, carrying weight yet spoken with practiced calm. Guns roared for the first time, their echo stretching across miles of water, a voice of authority and purpose. Shells arced gracefully through the air, their paths guided by skill and calculation, striking with precision rather than chaos. Even in the violence of engagement, the rhythm of preparation and anticipation persisted, a silent thread connecting crew, ship, and sea. And in that instant, the long stillness of the Atlantic was pierced by the deliberate, measured thunder of the First Salvos. Exeter's guns spoke first, cutting through the gentle swell of waves, their voice confident yet restrained. Sailors moved in harmony with the machinery beneath their feet, each step measured, each adjustment precise. The recoil of the gun sent vibrations through decks and hull, but the motion was controlled, as if the ship absorbed it into its structure without hesitation. Observers watched the shells arc, noting distance, wind, and trajectory with quiet intensity. Ajax and Achilles followed, their fire joining the rhythm of Exeter's, creating a chorus of measured force across the water. The Atlantic seemed to hum with the sound, carrying both energy and warning through its currents. On Graf Spee, the crew felt the first touch of distant steel, responding with their own deliberate calculations. The exchange was sudden, yet conducted with a discipline that made it almost ritualistic, a measured dialogue of power across miles. In these moments, time felt suspended, the sun and waves bearing silent witness to human resolve. And yet, even as fire and steel met, the sea maintained its timeless patience, holding both sides in its quiet embrace. The air was filled with smoke and heat, yet not the chaos of panic, but the calm intensity of skill applied under pressure. Sailors leaned into their duties, checking readings, adjusting angles, and maintaining awareness of wind and tide. The sound of steel meeting water echoed across the ocean, a rhythm that punctuated the roar of distant guns. Officers traced charts, imagining the future while measuring the present, their movements precise and deliberate. Men exchanged brief words, offering reassurance, sharing observations, and maintaining focus amid the sudden intensity. Even amid the first exchange, the Atlantic itself seemed to pulse, carrying the reverberations outward in soft, rolling waves. Each salvo was a punctuation in a long, intricate conversation, an unhurried dialogue between predator and pursuer. The horizon shimmered with motion and distance, blending sun, water, and smoke into a subtle tapestry. And in that blended light, sailors felt both the weight of duty and the strange calm of purpose. The First Salvos had spoken, and the story of the day unfolded quietly, yet insistently. Graf Spee responded with deliberate force, her guns rising and falling in precise arcs across the water. Her crew moved as one, trained hands adjusting, observing, calculating with an efficiency born of both discipline and urgency. The Atlantic carried the thunder of shells in waves that reached every corner of the ships, vibrating decks and echoing in minds alert to every nuance. Yet for all the power unleashed, there was a rhythm, a measured cadence that prevented chaos from overtaking order. Sailors noted each change in trajectory, each puff of smoke from the distant vessel, tracing unseen lines between steel and water. The early sunlight caught on her hull and turrets, casting elongated shadows across waves, a silent reminder of her presence and intent. Despite the suddenness of engagement, discipline and focus held sway, guiding movements as naturally as tide and wind. Even the smallest gestures, a glance, a whispered calculation, a gentle adjustment, were magnified in significance against the backdrop of action. In this delicate balance of force and control, each moment carried weight beyond its apparent brevity. And so the exchange continued, deliberate, intense, yet strangely controlled, as if the sea itself measured the pace. The British cruisers moved with quiet determination, their formations adjusting to anticipate each move, each curve of Graf Spee's trajectory. Sailors felt the subtle shifts in wind and wave, their hands steady on rails, eyes scanning both horizon and instruments. The firing continued in measured bursts, arcs of steel crossing open water with a graceful precision that belied the suddenness of battle. Officers whispered orders, each syllable deliberate, carrying instructions that rippled through decks and across the Atlantic like a soft echo. Even in the roar, there was a sense of choreography, a rhythm that transformed motion and energy into an almost meditative exchange. The sun glinted off shells and steel alike, reflecting the collision of human will and natural elements. Waves carried sounds, vibrations, and subtle signs that guided calculation and response on both sides. The Atlantic, vast and patient, absorbed each pulse, offering no judgment, yet marking the passage of this quiet confrontation. And in the midst of fire and calculation, sailors sensed a fleeting harmony between tension and control. The first salvos had begun, and the ocean itself seemed to bend around their measured presence. Time stretched in unusual ways, the rhythm of firing punctuating seconds into longer, almost reflective intervals. Sailors noted each flash, each puff of smoke, the gentle sway of the ships beneath their feet, anchoring them in the moment. The sun climbed higher, painting light across the water, in hues that softened the stark presence of steel and smoke. Officers adjusted angles and distances, ensuring that every measure of intent carried precision and care. Even as action unfolded, the Atlantic seemed to hold the world in suspension, the calm beneath waves juxtaposed against the sudden purposeful eruptions above them. The subtle pattern of motion became a language readable only to those attuned to the balance of force, wind, and water. Every ship carried its own internal rhythm, yet all moved in a shared cadence, dictated by circumstance and skill. Sailors felt the simultaneous thrill and calm of purpose, a paradox held in the steady weight of responsibility. And as shells crossed the expanse between steel and horizon, the day's story deepened in both intensity and quiet reflection. The engagement had begun, but the full rhythm of battle was yet to unfold. Shells struck near, water spraying in arcs that glimmered in the morning light, a gentle punctuation to the dialogue of fire. Sailors absorbed the vibrations through the decks, feeling each pulse as a reminder of presence and consequence. Officers traced imaginary lines between positions, adjusting, measuring, predicting, their calm focus guiding the unfolding engagement. Men exchanged small words, shared observations, and maintained a careful attention to the interplay of wind, tide, and distance. Each cruiser responded with deliberate action, the cadence of firing forming a rhythm that carried beyond individual ships. The Atlantic itself seemed to participate, rolling gently, reflecting sun and steel, absorbing energy without haste or judgment. Even in the heightened moment, the ocean's timeless patience lent a strange comfort, a sense of continuity amid abrupt change. Sailors noted this interplay with quiet awe, the suddenness of action tempered by observation and skill. The scene held a fragile balance between intensity and calm, between energy released and controlled purpose. And within that balance, the narrative of the battle began to breathe. The roar of the guns faded slightly as both sides measured their impact, recalibrating and anticipating. Sailors moved with quiet precision, returning to their stations, adjusting equipment, and noting subtle changes in position and wind. Officers whispered corrections, tracing trajectories across charts, shaping the future through calculation and foresight. The Atlantic, still reflecting gold and silver light, seemed to stretch infinitely, holding the battle gently in its folds. Every flash and echo carried meaning, every puff of smoke, a note in the ongoing conversation of engagement. Men felt both exhilaration and a calm awareness. Their bodies and minds aligned with the rhythm of purpose. Waves lapped against hulls with gentle insistence, contrasting the suddenness of the first exchanges, and in this contrast, sailors found clarity, their senses attuned to both the immediate and the inevitable. The opening moments of battle had passed, and the ships and crews settled into the intricate cadence of exchange. But the battle was only beginning, and its rhythm would ebb and flow like the tide. Exeter's steel hull shivered beneath the Atlantic sun as distant impacts reached her decks, a subtle reminder of the presence of Graf Spee. Smoke curled upward, thin at first, then heavier, drifting across rails and gun turrets, mingling with the scent of salt and metal. Sailors moved with careful urgency, adjusting guns, checking instruments, and tracing trajectories with steady hands. The ship groaned under strain, her timbers and steel flexing in quiet acknowledgement of the weight of battle. Officers whispered orders, their voices calm yet firm, guiding movements as naturally as the ocean guided the rolling waves. Below decks, men adjusted lines, secured equipment, and murmured reassurances to one another, small gestures of focus and courage. Even as alarms echoed faintly, the routine rhythm of duty held, a quiet backbone amid sudden intensity. Sunlight glinted on smoke and steel, casting patterns across decks, as if light itself acknowledged the struggle. And in this interplay of motion and quiet endurance, Exeter carried herself through the ordeal. The ship's determination was a soft, steady heartbeat amid the ocean's pulse. The bridge was a place of measured tension, officers tracing positions across charts with fingers that did not tremble. Exeter's captain observed the horizon with calm intensity, noting each puff of smoke, each curve of a distant silhouette. The wind carried the faint echo of distant gunfire, rolling in waves that mingled with the soft hum of engines. Sailors leaned into tasks, adjusting angles, watching instruments, and exchanging brief words, their voices low and deliberate. Every movement had meaning, every breath held in quiet anticipation. As the ship's rhythm maintained continuity amid sudden disturbance, below crew members moved steadily, securing doors and equipment, holding the ship's interior as constant as the rising sun. Even amidst the smoke, there was clarity, a sense that each hand, each glance, contributed to a shared purpose. The ocean's calm persisted beyond the roar, reflecting light and shadow, offering both challenge and reassurance. And as Exeter absorbed the strain, the ship itself seemed to breathe with resilience. Steadying those aboard, her ordeal became a testament to endurance, discipline, and quiet bravery. In the gunnery stations, sailors worked with precision, adjusting sights and calculating distances, their focus unbroken by the tremor of impact. Shells arced across the water, tracing graceful paths, and finding distant marks with deliberate care. The rhythm of firing was interspersed with moments of stillness, when eyes scanned horizon and sea, noting subtle shifts in distance, wind and light. Officers whispered corrections, recalculating angles, while men exchanged small signs of readiness, reassurance, and concentration. The hum of engines beneath decks provided a steady counterpoint, a gentle undercurrent to the sudden thunder of distant shells. Smoke, light, and reflection mingled, creating a landscape that seemed both chaotic and serene in its own strange harmony. Sailors adjusted rails and ropes, moving in measured patterns, each step contributing to the continuity of duty. Even as fire and impact drew close, the ship retained her poise, each action deliberate, each gesture meaningful. And in these moments, Exeter became a vessel of both endurance and quiet grace. The ordeal pressed upon her, yet the spirit aboard remained composed. Amid corridors and stairways, the crew moved with careful awareness, feeling the ship's shudder and the faint tremor of distant impact. Hands gripped rails, boots tapped on steel, and whispered words passed between stations. A language of calm in the face of sudden change. Smoke drifted through vents, curling around lights and machinery, carrying scent and shadow alike. The men adjusted instruments, secured supplies, and maintained a steady rhythm despite the unfolding strain. Even as tension rose, there was a quiet beauty in coordination. The interplay of human attention and steel structure. Officers checked logs, traced positions, and offered brief guidance, their calm demeanor anchoring the crew's focus. Every heartbeat, every step, became part of a subtle orchestration that carried the ship forward. Sunlight and smoke painted gentle patterns across decks, softening the edges of intensity with reflection, and within that reflection, sailors found focus, balance, and a sense of shared endurance. Exeter, though challenged, held herself with quiet dignity across the rolling waves. The upper decks shimmered with light and shadow. Each rail, turret, and splash of spray reflecting a soft cadence of movement. Sailors adjusted positions, leaning into tasks with the precision of habit and training. The wind carried a mix of salt, metal, and faint smoke, blending into a sensory rhythm that guided awareness. Orders moved between officers and crew with gentle clarity, each syllable measured and meaningful. Even as the ship absorbed distant impacts, there was a harmony in the mechanics of action, a quiet discipline in the orchestration of human and steel. Guns fired, arcs traced across reflective water, and shells struck distant targets with the grace of calculated force. Below, crew members adjusted machinery, checked engines, and maintained the quiet continuity of life aboard. The Atlantic seemed patient, holding the ship's passage, reflecting light, absorbing energy, and providing an invisible measure of distance and time. And as Exeter persisted, the ship's resilience became a silent witness to the courage and focus of those aboard. Smoke and light danced softly, carrying the story forward across the water. The captain moved across the bridge with steady steps, observing, calculating, and guiding, a presence both calm and commanding. Every decision was deliberate, every glance held the weight of purpose, yet spoken without rush or alarm. Sailors followed the rhythm of orders, their hands and eyes tracing tasks with quiet concentration. The gentle sway of the Atlantic, beneath the hull, reminded them of the continuity of the world beyond sudden intensity. Each puff of smoke from distant shells became a note in the dialogue of engagement, a marker of distance, angle, and intent. Officers conferred quietly, balancing aggression with caution, control with awareness. Below decks, men maintained equipment, secured lines, and offered small gestures of reassurance to neighbors, a chain of focus and care. Even in the height of the ordeal, the ship's discipline held, each action contributing to a measured, quiet purpose. And as the battle pressed upon Exeter, the crew remained anchored in routine skill and shared determination. The weight of confrontation rested upon her, but she moved forward with grace and steadiness. Through smoke, vibration, and sunlit reflection, Exeter carried herself as a vessel defined by endurance and courage. Sailors noted each tremor, each change in pitch or roll, responding with instinct honed through training and habit, indifferent to the quiet human struggle above. Orders moved through the ship in measured tones, each word reinforcing continuity and focus. Guns fired in arcs, shells striking distant water with deliberate precision, contributing to the rhythm of engagement. Officers and crew maintained poise, tracing lines of movement, anticipating shifts, and adjusting subtly to maintain control. Below, the machinery hummed in constant motion, a steady pulse beneath the occasional tremor of distant impact. The interplay of light, shadow, and smoke painted the decks with quiet intensity, each movement amplified by reflection. And within this interplay, Exeter held herself with quiet dignity, a testament to human resilience and discipline. She fought to live, but the weight of battle shifted to the remaining two. With Exeter withdrawing to regroup, Ajax and Achilles took the forefront, their hulls cutting lightly through the soft swells of the South Atlantic. Sailors moved with quiet precision, eyes scanning the horizon, fingers tracing instruments, and voices low yet deliberate. The two cruisers seemed to dance across the water, weaving in and out of distance, shaping their path with care and intent. Shells arced gracefully through the morning light, striking near enough to signal presence, yet careful to preserve the rhythm of engagement. Officers whispered adjustments, noting wind, tide, and the subtle sway of their own vessels. Below decks, men maintained engines and guns, hands steady, each movement a testament to training and calm focus. The Atlantic reflected gold and silver hues, carrying smoke and echoes across gentle waves, softening the edges of tension. Even in the abruptness of action, there was a sense of harmony, a quiet dialogue between steel, sea, and human intention. Every maneuver was measured, deliberate, and yet imbued with a subtle energy, a pulse that echoed across decks. And in this rhythm, Ajax and Achilles kept Graf Spee within reach, refusing to let her move unchallenged. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across waves, highlighting the small arcs of spray thrown up by each vessel's movement. Sailors adjusted their stations, leaning slightly into the wind, feeling the motion beneath their feet, and tracking the subtle shifts of Graf Spee's distance. Every shell fired was both a warning and a message, a punctuation in the unfolding conversation of steel and strategy. Officers communicated quietly between ships, coordinating maneuvers with the calm efficiency that only practice could produce. The gentle sway of the ocean beneath them became a counterpoint to the quick, precise arcs of shells above it. Even amid sudden bursts of engagement, the rhythm of preparation and response persisted, a shared heartbeat across two ships. Sailors felt the tension as a gentle pressure, a quiet energy that required focus, patience, and balance. Light shimmered on metal, water, and smoke, softening the intensity into a reflective harmony. And though the distance to Graf Spee fluctuated, the sense of control remained, guiding each movement with deliberate care. The Atlantic stretched on, a witness to this quiet, continuous dance of pursuit. Ajax edged closer, her engines humming steadily, while Achilles mirrored the motion with delicate precision. Officers traced imagined lines across charts, predicting movement, adjusting angles, and refining timing, each calculation a note in a slow symphony of strategy. Sailors leaned over rails, scanning for smoke, reflection, or subtle shift in color that might signal movement. Even in moments of brief calm, the presence of Graf Spee pressed quietly against awareness, shaping decisions with invisible weight. Every shell fired, every maneuver executed, maintained both distance and pressure, a paradox held in deliberate motion. Below decks, men secured hatches, monitored engines, and moved with the careful rhythm of practiced hands. The ocean seemed to pulse with energy, carrying ripples of wind, sound, and tension across miles. Light caught on ripples, on steel and on smoke, blending elements into a soft, reflective tableau. And in this interplay, The cruiser's persistent pressure kept the larger vessel focused and constrained. Each action reinforced both caution and courage, the quiet dialogue of intent made visible across the waves. The afternoon waned, yet the maneuvers continued, subtle, precise, and unhurried in appearance but tense beneath the surface. Sailors noted the slight changes in wind direction, the gentle rise and fall of waves, and the varying glint of steel along the horizon. Officers whispered coordinates and adjustments, passing orders that traveled in measured tones between decks. Even the smallest gestures, raising a flag, adjusting a line, or moving slightly on a turret, carried meaning in the delicate ballet of engagement. The Atlantic reflected the subtle energy of the encounter, absorbing fire, movement, and calculation without judgment. Crew members moved with awareness, balancing alertness with steady hands, maintaining rhythm amidst unpredictability. Shells arced and splashed with graceful precision, contributing to the intricate dialogue of the duel. The sun dipped slowly, casting long bands of gold across the water, softening shadows and highlighting arcs of smoke. And in this measured rhythm, the Atlantic seemed to guide the dance, offering both space and constraint. The cruisers pressed forward, a quiet determination shaping every course and movement. Achilles darted closer, then fell back with careful timing, weaving a pattern that kept Graf Spee occupied and reactive. Sailors noted subtle cues from water patterns to distant puffs of smoke, translating them into quiet action without haste. Officers calculated distances and timing with low, deliberate voices, crafting a strategy that relied on patience as much as skill. The gentle rocking of the ships, the constant hum of engines, and the quiet ripple of waves beneath provided a steady counterpoint to the tension above. Even amid repeated arcs of fire, the ocean's calm persistence carried both ship and crew, grounding attention in measured perception. Every movement, every adjustment, reinforced discipline and the subtle rhythm of engagement. Shells struck the water near the enemy, creating arcs of spray that shimmered briefly in the afternoon light. Sailors felt the pulse of the ocean, aligning themselves with both its stability and its subtle unpredictability. And in this choreography of small, deliberate actions, the cruisers forced Graf Spee to respond, unable to find freedom of movement. Each maneuver brought them closer to nightfall, and to the choice that Captain Langsdorff would soon face. The sun continued its slow descent, casting the waves in hues of gold and shadow, a calm counterpoint to the underlying intensity of engagement. Sailors adjusted sightlines, recalculated distances, and maintained steady focus, moving with gentle precision. Officers guided maneuvers, whispering corrections and adjustments, maintaining continuity of intent across both vessels. The Atlantic mirrored their discipline, waves rolling softly, wind carrying gentle reminders of distance and presence. Even in repeated exchanges, there was a quiet poetry in the arcs of shells and the motion of steel, a rhythm visible only to attentive eyes. Crew members below decks felt the subtle vibrations, moving in harmony with the vessel above them, reinforcing stability and readiness. The horizon stretched long and unbroken, a constant reminder of both isolation and connection in the vast expanse. And through the reflection of sunlight on smoke and water, the cruisers maintained pressure, shaping the movements of their larger opponent. The day waned gently, carrying both resolve and anticipation into the approaching hours. Their quiet persistence shaped the unfolding narrative, a calm determination against shadowed steel. As afternoon slipped toward evening, Ajax and Achilles continued their gentle harassment, arcs of fire precise, deliberate, and controlled. Sailors noted every subtle change in Graf Spee's movement, translating observation into measured action. Officers whispered adjustments, their calm focus guiding each maneuver with quiet authority. The ocean reflected golds and silvers, softening smoke and arcs of shell into a tapestry of light and motion. Every movement, from the tilt of a turret to the adjustment of a line, contributed to the steady pressure maintained across the waves. Below decks, engines hummed in constant rhythm, a steady heartbeat beneath the subtle chaos above. The Atlantic absorbed tension and energy, carrying sound, motion, and reflection across a vast expanse. And in this quiet orchestration, the cruisers shaped the conditions of engagement, holding their larger opponent within a carefully drawn perimeter. Time moved slowly, carrying both determination and patience toward an inevitable decision. Each maneuver brought them closer to nightfall, and to the choice that Captain Langsdorff would soon face. The light softened, waves reflected long shadows, and the horizon blended sea and sky in gentle gradients. Sailors adjusted positions, their movements deliberate, fingers tracing instruments with calm attention. Officers coordinated, passing whispers that carried strategy across the decks with quiet precision. The Atlantic maintained a slow rhythm, grounding motion and observation in its unhurried pulse. Shells arced with grace, striking water near enough to communicate presence and pressure without unnecessary haste. Every glance, every movement, every adjustment carried meaning in the delicate balance of pursuit. Even as the day waned, the focus of crew and ship remained, synchronized with the invisible rhythm of distance and motion. The cruisers pressed forward, a steady pulse against the larger, calculating vessel that mirrored their energy. Sunlight softened smoke and steel alike, creating reflections that painted both tension and beauty. And with the fading light, every movement hinted at the approaching choice that would shape the night. After hours of concentrated exchange, a curious quiet settled over the Atlantic, as though the sea itself exhaled, releasing the tension that had coiled it for so long. Graf Spee, her guns now silent, had drawn back, slipping beyond immediate reach, leaving ripples and faint smoke as reminders of her presence. Sailors aboard Ajax and Achilles paused, leaning against rails, fingers brushing damp steel, listening to the subtle creaks of hull and rigging. The ocean's rhythm returned to its soft rolling cadence, waves lapping against hulls with gentle insistence. Officers exchanged quiet words, recalculating distance and condition, tracing lines across charts that now seemed both familiar and uncertain. Below decks, crew members moved with subdued purpose, adjusting machinery, tending minor damage, and sharing brief acknowledgments of endurance. Even the sun seemed to soften its light, glinting across the water in calm golds and silvers, reflecting smoke and movement like a memory rather than a present threat. Sailors took in the vast horizon, the endless blend of sea and sky, a soothing counterpoint to the sudden intensity they had endured. Every breath was deeper, every glance slower, as if the Atlantic itself encouraged reflection and patience. And yet, even in this lull, the mind traced possibilities and outcomes, aware that the day's story was not complete. The silence carried a subtle weight, a presence almost tangible in the gentle rocking of the cruisers. Sailors walked along decks with slower steps, hands trailing over railings, feeling the lingering vibrations of spent fire through metal and timber. Officers traced notes across logs, recording events with care, their pens moving steadily as though the act itself reinforced the ship's endurance. The hum of engines beneath decks became a gentle anchor, a constant reminder that beneath quiet reflection, life continued in measured rhythm. Men exchanged quiet murmurs, assessing damage, noting changes, and sharing observations with a calm deliberation born from experience. The Atlantic seemed to cradle the ships, waves rolling softly, reflecting clouds and sun in a slow, undulating dance. Smoke from earlier engagement drifted in thin, curling ribbons, fading gradually, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder into open air. Even distant gulls moved with a quiet grace, their circling patterns slow and deliberate, echoing the newfound calm. Sailors felt a sense of temporary reprieve, a moment to breathe and to measure their surroundings anew. The battlefield had paused, yet the story of pursuit, endurance, and anticipation lingered quietly in every swell. Exeter, at some distance, rested with slow determination, her crew attending to each challenge with calm efficiency. The damage she carried was evident, yet the ship retained a dignity that reflected the discipline and courage of those aboard. Sailors traced lines of impact, noted minor repairs, and shared quiet gestures of reassurance, sustaining both vessel and spirit. Officers whispered among themselves, recalculating strength, observing positions, and preparing for the next movement in this fluid, shifting narrative. The sun highlighted metal and deck alike, catching on water-splashed rails and smoke-stained turrets, creating reflections of light and memory. The wind carried subtle scents of salt, smoke, and earth, a quiet mixture that reminded men of both distance and proximity. Each gentle swell of the Atlantic seemed to wash away tension, leaving calm and space to consider both triumph and cost. The ship moved slowly, deliberately, following a rhythm that matched the breathing of her crew. Even in partial stillness, purpose guided every hand, every glance, every step along decks, and in this quiet moment, the mind began to trace the horizon, wondering where Graf Spee might next appear. Across the rolling waves, the other British cruisers moved with equally tempered energy, their hulls slicing water in soft, reflective arcs. Sailors paused to note the horizon, the patterns of light across ripples, and the subtle interplay of wind against steel. Conversations were few, measured, and low, voices mingling with the gentle hiss of water and hum of engines. Officers traced positions, recorded observations, and shared quiet calculations, mapping possibilities across charts with careful precision. Even the small movements of crew, securing hatches, adjusting equipment, or walking between stations, carried meaning and discipline. The Atlantic seemed patient, reflecting sun, smoke, and shadow, holding both presence and absence in its vast expanse. Waves rolled softly beneath hulls, gentle yet insistent, reminding men of both distance and connection, presence and expectation. The quiet seemed to stretch time, allowing reflection on both what had passed and what might come. Sailors felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation, grounded in rhythm, yet alert to subtle signals. And in this unfolding pause, the story of pursuit and preparation continued quietly across the water. The afternoon light shifted gradually, softening shadows and deepening reflections, creating a calm mosaic across decks and sea. Sailors leaned against rails, hands tracing familiar steel, feeling each vibration as both memory and measurement. Officers whispered notes and adjustments, balancing caution with awareness, ensuring that readiness remained even in lull. Below decks, engines hummed gently, conveying continuity, reliability, and reassurance, anchoring minds as well as machinery. The Atlantic carried subtle currents of sound and energy, reflecting distant echoes of the earlier engagement, soft and undemanding. Even the scent of salt and smoke mingled in a gentle rhythm, reminding crew of both endurance and care. Every glance toward the horizon was slow, deliberate, a meditation on space, time, and potential movement. Sailors adjusted instruments and positions with careful awareness, their actions deliberate, measured, and purposeful. And in this delicate calm the cruisers settled into observation, preparation, and quiet reflection. The battlefield had paused, yet the mind traced the unseen paths of the day. Clouds moved slowly, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across water and hull, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. Sailors exchanged muted words, checking instruments, reporting minor changes, and maintaining the soft rhythm of attentive presence. Officers traced lines of motion across charts, planning for nightfall, for repairs, and for any sign of Graf Spee's re-emergence. The Atlantic's subtle swells carried sound and vibration, anchoring attention while softening the edges of tension. Below decks, men moved with careful focus, checking machinery, noting minor damage, and sustaining both ship and spirit. The gentle hum of engines and the hiss of water against hull reinforced continuity, a grounding rhythm beneath observation and anticipation. The light reflected softly across decks, highlighting smoke trails and steel, turning intensity into reflection. Sailors felt the unusual calm of a pause, a moment that encouraged quiet meditation while alertness remained. And in this soft interval, the memory of action lingered, weaving between waves, steel, and horizon. The battlefield was not finished. It had only shifted to the shores of Uruguay. Graf Spee moved slowly through the soft expanse of the Rio de la Plata, her steel hull cutting quietly through reflective waters as Montevideo's distant shore approached. The city lay in calm repose, its streets and port bathed in gentle sunlight, indifferent yet observant of the vessel's quiet entrance. Sailors on deck moved with deliberate care, noting every adjustment, every sway of the ship, as it responded to shallow waters and guiding tugs. The engines hummed steadily beneath decks, a subtle reminder of life and motion in contrast to the stillness of the harbor. Flags fluttered softly in the harbor breeze, signaling arrival, identity, and intent without a word. Even distant voices from dock workers carried lightly across the water, muted by distance and softened by the rhythm of gentle waves. Officers traced lines along charts, recalculating positions, and observing the slow approach with calm intent. The Atlantic's earlier turbulence had been replaced by a patient, reflective calm, folding Graf Spee into the harbor with deliberate quiet. Sailors leaned on rails, feeling the rhythm of motion beneath them, a gentle reassurance of continuity and purpose. And in this harbor of exile, time itself became a weapon. Men on the decks adjusted to the slow, measured pace, each movement both necessary and careful, mindful of the constraints of international law. The ship's presence drew soft attention from officials and onlookers, their eyes tracing the lines of steel and shadow, recording every quiet gesture. Sailors moved along the hull with deliberate steps, listening to the gentle lap of water against the bow, the faint creak of mooring lines. Officers consulted quietly, weighing minutes against regulations, the ship's needs against the strictures of neutrality. Even as the sun glinted on water and metal, reflection softened the edges of anticipation and concern. Below decks, crew moved with rhythmic calm, tending engines and equipment, maintaining continuity in both movement and morale. Gentle breezes carried the scent of salt and earth, mingling with faint smoke from distant chimneys, creating a quiet tapestry of presence and place. Sailors noted distant voices, the soft clatter of activity along the docks, the ebb of commerce continuing unperturbed. Each step, glance, and gesture was measured, deliberate, harmonized with the slow rhythm of arrival. And in this quiet Graf Spee settled among the port, a vessel both watched and constrained. The city's harbor stretched ahead, its piers and moorings reflecting light on water, creating patterns of shadow and gold that softened observation. Sailors felt the gentle sway of the ship beneath their feet, each vibration a subtle connection to both steel and sea. Officers moved along decks, consulting maps, noting the location of neutral ships, and maintaining awareness of every approaching vessel. Even the hum of the engines became a soothing presence, a quiet pulse beneath observation and anticipation. Sailors checked lines, secured equipment, and exchanged low words of instruction and reassurance. The Atlantic's calm had shifted into the river's softer flow, each ripple carrying reflection and time in measured waves. Flags adjusted gently to the breeze, communicating identity, position, and compliance in quiet motion. Observers on shore moved slowly, noting the ship's presence, yet restrained by protocol, their gaze distant but attentive. Each moment seemed stretched, imbued with both anticipation and patience, a reflection of the delicate balance between action and law. And in this harbor of exile, time itself became a silent, deliberate instrument. The Rio de la Plata embraced the ship with gentle currents, guiding her hull past the piers and into allocated berth. Sailors traced lines along the decks, noting mooring points, adjusting ropes, and maintaining careful balance against the slow rolling motion. Officers conferred quietly, weighing needs against rules, observing shadows and reflections in the sun-dappled water. Below decks, men ensured machinery hummed steadily, maintaining both energy and morale, a quiet backbone to measured calm above. Gentle ripples carried faint reflections of city life, children's voices, distant footsteps, and the soft clatter of crates on piers. Even the smallest movements, a glance, a hand adjustment, a shift in stance were imbued with purpose, maintaining rhythm and precision. Sunlight softened edges of steel and shadow, smoke drifting lightly from stacks, blending presence and reflection. Sailors leaned on rails, listening to the subtle creaks and groans of the hull as it responded to the gentle pull of mooring lines. Every movement, every sound, every breath was measured, intentional, harmonized with the quiet patience of harbor and river. And in this stillness, Graf Spee waited, constrained by law, yet defined by presence. Officials and observers moved along the quays with quiet deliberation, noting the vessel without interference, the harbor alive yet calm. Sailors adjusted ropes and fenders, listening to the gentle tug of water and the hum of lines stretching with soft tension. Officers recorded details, consulted charts, and spoke in low tones about regulations, timing, and protocol. The Atlantic's distant turmoil was replaced by reflective calm, the river's gentle current, a subtle reminder of order and patience. Smoke curled softly from stacks, catching sun in slow glimmering patterns, blending with light on rippling water. Below decks, men moved with quiet purpose, attending to machinery, monitoring engines, and maintaining continuity of both function and morale. Sailors noted distant gulls circling above, their quiet arcs echoing the slow rhythm of harbor life. Every gesture, every step, and every glance contributed to a silent dialogue of compliance, strategy, and reflection. Even as the vessel rested, there was awareness of potential, of time, decisions, and consequences waiting quietly in the soft horizon. And in this harbor of exile, time itself became a weapon. The sun shifted toward evening, casting long, gentle reflections across water, steel, and smoke, softening every edge. Sailors felt the gentle sway of moored hulls, their hands tracing familiar rails with quiet attentiveness. Officers conferred quietly, considering rules, positions, and the slow unfolding of both diplomacy and human choice. Waves lapped softly against hulls, carrying light, shadow, and reflection across decks with a rhythmic calm. Crew below adjusted machinery, monitored equipment, and whispered low instructions, maintaining a careful continuity of function. The Atlantic and river met in subtle convergence, carrying the memory of action and the expectation of pause. Even distant voices, the shuffle of feet on piers, and the gentle hiss of water along hulls contributed to a pervasive, quiet rhythm. Sailors noted the interplay of light on metal, the curl of smoke, the reflection of clouds, integrating these into the soft cadence of observation. Every movement remained deliberate, measured and gentle, reinforcing both calm and awareness. And in this harbor of exile, time itself became a weapon. Shadows deepened along the piers as evening approached, softening edges, reflecting light across gentle waves and stretching across decks. Sailors leaned into the quiet, observing motion, maintaining instruments, and tracing lines of calm action. Officers whispered notes, calculated intervals, and guided adjustment with low voices, preserving both readiness and restraint. Below, crew maintained hum of machinery, attended to minor repairs, and moved with gentle focus, harmonizing with the slow rhythm of the river. The Atlantic's earlier turbulence lingered only as memory, a backdrop to the quiet deliberation and observation in the present. Smoke drifted lightly, bending with wind, catching light, and reflecting across decks in soft arcs. Sailors observed subtle cues in water and horizon, translating each into careful action, without haste or alarm. Even distant gulls and shifting clouds contributed to a serene, almost meditative awareness aboard the vessel. Every breath, every glance, and every step became part of the shared rhythm of calm preparation. And in this harbor of exile, time itself became a weapon. Lights softened across the city, the river, and decks alike, blending shadow and reflection into quiet meditation. Sailors traced rails, adjusted ropes, and moved deliberately, maintaining both attention and calm. Officers recorded positions, checked charts, and passed whispered observations, preserving awareness and continuity. The Atlantic's faraway waves were gentle memories, replaced by a slow pulse of river and harbor. Crew below continued rhythmic tasks, hum of engines and soft movement, harmonizing with reflection above. Smoke mingled with the evening breeze, forming delicate patterns across steel and water. Every motion was deliberate, every sound measured, every glance purposeful, maintaining the soft equilibrium of anticipation and observation. Sailors and officers alike absorbed the calm, the uncertainty, and the slow rhythm of the present, blending patience with awareness. The city, the river, and the ship shared a quiet conversation, measured in shadow, light, and reflection. In this harbor of exile, time itself became a weapon. The sun settled low above Montevideo, casting long reflections across calm waters as the city's soft bustle mingled with the quiet presence of Graf Spee. Sailors moved deliberately across decks, tracing familiar steel, adjusting ropes, and noting every shift of the vessel beneath them. Officers conferred in low tones, whispers carrying discussions of neutrality, timing, and the subtle pressures imposed by foreign diplomats. The wind carried faint scents of salt, smoke, and distant city streets, blending into a rhythm that matched careful observation and anticipation. Below decks, machinery hummed steadily, a grounding pulse beneath the quiet tension above. Flags fluttered in the soft breeze, symbols of identity, compliance, and the delicate balance of international law. Even as the sun lowered, the air carried a gentle energy, a soft insistence that time was moving with deliberate patience. Sailors noted shadows across decks and water, reading them as signals, reminders of boundaries and presence. Every small gesture, every careful step, carried meaning beyond immediate comprehension, a dance between observation and restraint, and every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. Officers moved between decks, exchanging whispered notes and quiet observations, weighing possibilities in low, careful tones. Sailors followed established rhythms, maintaining position, checking lines, and sustaining machinery, their movements both deliberate and measured. The Atlantic beyond Montevideo remained soft and reflective, carrying distant echoes of earlier waves and quiet whispers of history. Diplomats and local officials negotiated across polished tables, their words precise, deliberate, and charged with the subtle weight of consequence. Smoke from stacks drifted lazily into the evening, catching the last rays of light, softening intensity into reflection. Crew below adjusted engines, secured equipment, and shared muted words of guidance, maintaining continuity and morale. Sailors leaned lightly against rails, listening to the gentle lap of water and the faint murmur of distant city life. Shadows deepened across the decks and river, a calm yet persistent reminder of the evening's slow progression. Each gesture, note, and observation became a part of the quiet negotiation, measured against both law and circumstance, and every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. The harbour seemed suspended in a delicate balance, waters still, reflections soft, edges blurred by lingering light. Sailors traced lines along decks, noting slight movements, adjusting their positions, and sustaining both vessel and attention. Officers consulted quietly, balancing urgency against patience, law against necessity, and strategy against diplomacy. Even the hum of machinery became a comforting pulse beneath careful observation and anticipation. Flags shifted gently in the wind, echoing subtle messages between vessel and port, a quiet language understood by few. The city's distant hum carried across water, faint footsteps, voices, and the shuffle of activity blending into soft rhythm. Sailors observed the soft sway of the hull, its responses to tides and currents, grounding awareness in both presence and motion. Below decks, crew maintained instruments, tending to needs with calm precision, reinforcing both routine and readiness. Every breath, glance, and adjustment became a part of the slow orchestration that held tension in quiet equilibrium, and every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. Evening shadows lengthened across piers and decks, painting steel and water in reflective gradients of gold and grey. Sailors moved with purpose yet quiet restraint, each gesture deliberate, imbued with a soft awareness of context and consequence. Officers whispered across charts and logs, tracing positions, timing, and the subtle interplay of legal and diplomatic boundaries. The wind carried the scent of the river, salt and faint smoke, blending movement and presence into gentle rhythm. Machinery hummed softly below decks, a consistent heartbeat grounding attention amid anticipation. Sailors exchanged brief, low words of reassurance, maintaining morale and continuity through careful routine. Reflections on water shifted slowly with clouds and wind, creating patterns that suggested both presence and absence, action and stillness. Even distant gulls moved in arcs above, their quiet flight echoing the slow progression of time across the harbour. Each small observation, adjustment, and note was a part of the patient choreography of diplomacy, and every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. Captain Langsdorff moved deliberately along the bridge, his gaze tracing water, horizon, and distant city. each glance measured, each step purposeful. Officers whispered counsel, suggesting timing, phrasing, and cautious strategy, their words soft but weighted. Sailors followed established routines, their hands and eyes steady, maintaining both vessel and calm presence. The harbour held them gently, water lapping softly against hull, carrying reflections of light and shadow across decks. Flags and signals fluttered quietly in the evening breeze, each movement a subtle reminder of identity, law, and diplomacy. Below decks, hum of engines and machinery persisted, a steady undercurrent beneath tension and anticipation. Sailors observed light fading, shadows lengthening, and smoke curling gently upward, incorporating each detail into a sense of rhythm and flow. Even as the world's gaze focused upon the harbour, the ship maintained calm discipline and presence. Every subtle movement, word and gesture contributed to a quiet negotiation, a dialogue unspoken but understood, and every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. Light softened further, casting golden and grey gradients across water, steel, and smoke, merging intensity and reflection into quiet rhythm. Sailors traced rails, adjusted equipment, and moved slowly yet deliberately, maintaining balance across decks and purpose within routine. Officers observed charts, consulted logs, and whispered advice, threading law, strategy, and diplomacy into careful calculation. The Atlantic beyond seemed suspended, each ripple reflective, absorbing tension without resistance, echoing the slow passage of minutes. Below decks, machinery hummed steadily, crew maintaining function with quiet precision, their rhythm aligning with the gentle sway above. Sailors exchanged brief, muted gestures of acknowledgement, reinforcing focus and shared awareness. Smoke curled lightly from stacks, catching last light, softening edges, and blending with reflections on water. Even distant city sounds were softened, carried on the river, contributing to a calm, reflective atmosphere. Every detail, line, movement, signal, and breath was observed, measured, and integrated into the unfolding equilibrium. And every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. Shadows deepened across decks, water, and piers, a quiet reminder that evening's progression was measured, slow, and deliberate. Sailors adjusted positions, maintaining steady hands, attentive eyes, and quiet gestures, reinforcing both readiness and calm. Officers whispered counsel and interpretation, balancing intent, legality, and timing across the still harbour. Waves lapped gently against hulls, carrying reflections of light, smoke, and distant movement, threading calm into attentive awareness. Flags fluttered in subtle arcs, speaking in quiet language to observers, officials, and distant watchers. Below decks, crew moved with soft precision, attending to instruments, monitoring machinery, and maintaining continuity in routine and morale. Sailors traced reflections across decks, steel and water, integrating observation into rhythm and anticipation. Even the faintest echo of movement on piers or in the city carried meaning, noted in soft gestures and quiet assessment. Each gesture, observation, and whisper reinforced a slow orchestration of presence, strategy, and patience. And every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. The last light of evening settled across water and steel, softening all edges into a gradient of shadow and reflection. Sailors and officers alike moved with calm focus, aware of the slow passage of time, of law, diplomacy, and expectation. The Atlantic and river combined in gentle pulse beneath the hull, steadying both vessel and mind. Below decks, machinery hummed in quiet rhythm, crew maintaining continuity, precision and care. Smoke drifted lightly across decks, reflecting fading sunlight, softening intensity into gentle contemplation. Sailors observed the movement of tides, wind, and shadows, integrating each into awareness of presence and consequence. Every note, whisper, and gesture became part of the careful orchestration of this delicate period. The harbour seemed suspended between day and night, observation and anticipation, calm and rising tension. Even as the world's gaze lingered, the ship retained dignity, discipline, and deliberate presence. And every hour passed like a drumbeat, counting down to a decision no one could avoid. Sailors moved slowly along Graf Spee's decks, tracing familiar steel with hands both gentle and attentive, as if the ship itself could provide comfort in uncertain times. Their eyes wandered to the horizon, where water met sky, searching for reassurance in endless blues and soft greys. Conversations were low, careful, punctuated by laughter or sighs that seemed to echo lightly against the hull. Below decks, crew attended to engines, instruments, and minor repairs, maintaining rhythm and routine in a world suspended by diplomacy and delay. The scent of salt, smoke, and warm metal mingled with the faint aroma of food, creating a subtle tapestry of sensory familiarity. Even the smallest motions, a rope adjusted, a hatch secured, a chart consulted, carried meaning, a quiet assertion of purpose amid uncertainty. The Atlantic's distant waves rolled steadily, imparting calm, reflecting light, and softening thoughts of far-off ports and homes. Sailors thought quietly of letters, familiar streets, the faces of loved ones, and dreams postponed by duty. Each man felt the slow pull of time, elongated by waiting, filled with introspection and gentle anticipation. Yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck, with history pressing against him. The wind stirred lightly, rustling flags and rippling water, creating a quiet, continuous rhythm that the crew absorbed in measured breaths. Sailors paused in their steps to lean against railings, feeling the gentle sway beneath them, the reassuring pulse of the ship's heart. Below, engines hummed with steady constancy, a subtle undercurrent that reinforced both calm and vigilance. Conversations drifted softly, tales of home whispered, shared quietly to keep spirits anchored in memory and hope. Officers moved among them with subdued presence, guiding, instructing, and observing without breaking the tranquil tempo. The sun reflected off water and steel in warm, liquid patterns, softening shadows and lending a gentle glow to weary faces. Each ripple along the hull carried echoes of distant action, fading into the serenity of this moment. Measured yet weighty, sailors found solace in routine, their hands moving with practiced ease, their eyes reflecting horizon and expectation. The quiet became a companion, a silent rhythm intertwining with thought, memory, and the distant hum of engines. And yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck with history pressing against him. Meals were taken in subdued, orderly fashion, the clatter of cutlery softened by careful hands and attentive ears. Sailors spoke in low tones of towns they had visited, of laughter shared and storms weathered, stitching connection between past and present. The gentle swell of the river and harbour lent a natural cadence to each step, each conversation, each quiet reflection. Officers observed with patient watchfulness, their presence subtle, their guidance woven into the still rhythm of life aboard. Even the faint hiss of escaping steam, or the click of instruments below decks, became a gentle cadence, a reminder of continuity and care. Sailors traced patterns on deck, mapping them in memory, letting the mind wander along both metal and water. Smoke drifted lazily from stacks, catching late light, curling and dissolving like thoughts in the wind. The Atlantic's presence remained in every wave, every breath of wind, every reflection across steel, a soft reminder of the vast world outside. Even in the lull of waiting, tension lingered, tempered by routine, reflection and quiet companionship. Yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck with history pressing against him. Letters written in secret, folded carefully, and tucked away, revealed longing, hope, and tender remembrance among the crew. Sailors traced pen on paper with delicate attention, imagining faraway hands receiving words of connection and care. The gentle rocking of the ship echoed the rhythm of the heart, slow and steady, integrating thought, memory, and quiet anticipation. Officers conferred quietly about supply, positions, and protocol, their voices low and measured, blending into the calm of the evening. The water reflected shades of soft gold and muted grey, carrying warmth and distance across hulls and decks. Sailors paused in their work to watch distant gulls glide in arcs above the river, a small, quiet reminder of freedom and movement. Even the smell of warm metal mixed with salt and fading smoke provided comfort, anchoring men to the familiar heartbeat of the ship. Every small action, gesture, and thought wove together, maintaining rhythm, focus, and mental refuge. In quiet moments, each sailor found a fragile balance between duty, hope, and longing, and yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck, with history pressing against him. Evening shadows deepened along the decks, softening contours, stretching railings, and blending with reflections across the water. Sailors moved with slow deliberation, hands brushing steel, eyes tracing horizon and city alike, reading signals in light and shadow. Officers whispered counsel and instruction, preserving both order and calm, attentive to each shift in mood, each ripple in routine. Below decks, hum of machinery persisted, gentle and consistent, grounding thoughts amid stillness and waiting. Sailors observed clouds drifting slowly, smoke curling upward, water shimmering with gentle light, integrating each into their contemplative rhythm. Conversations of home and distant friends mingled softly, each tale shared in low tones, as if carried on the wind to memory itself. Even the quiet lapping of water against the hull became a gentle companion, a subtle rhythm for reflection and rest. Every movement, adjustment, and glance was deliberate, maintaining both routine and calm, balancing responsibility with patience. The world beyond the harbor seemed distant, yet every thought and memory pulled gently at hearts and minds. Yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck with history pressing against him. The river's gentle current carried reflections of sun and sky across hull and deck, softening even the hardest edges of concern. Sailors paused to lean against rails, feeling the slow movement beneath them, connecting each step to both ship and moment. Officers moved quietly among the men, observing, guiding, ensuring continuity without disturbing the fragile calm. Smoke curled gently from stacks, drifting into the evening breeze, mingling with salt and metal to create a familiar tapestry. Sailors exchanged quiet words, reassurances and reflections, sharing small pieces of themselves with comrades whose presence was immediate and grounding. Below decks, engines hummed steadily, instruments clicked, and machinery moved in quiet, persistent rhythm, a heartbeat beneath the reflective stillness above. Light shifted slowly, creating patterns across decks, water, and hull, blending shadow and warmth in a tranquil mosaic. Each sailor absorbed in thought or duty found rhythm and meditation in repetition, presence, and movement. Even distant voices from shore or other ships became part of the soft texture, gentle and measured, and yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck with history pressing against him. Moonlight began to soften the last traces of sunset, casting silver across water, hull and steel, blending horizon and reflection. Sailors traced familiar rails, adjusted ropes, and maintained positions with quiet attentiveness, observing both ship and river. Officers whispered advice, shared notes, and weighed possibilities in low tones, preserving calm and order above a quiet tension. Machinery below hummed, grounding the moment in continuity and gentle rhythm, carrying routine into stillness. Sailors shared stories, memories, and hopes in measured low voices, bridging distance between sea and home. Even the slow swirl of smoke and shifting reflections lent subtle texture to observation and reflection. The gentle sway of the vessel synchronized with heartbeats and thought, creating soft continuity between man, ship, and river. Every gesture, glance, and breath became part of the unspoken choreography of waiting, reflection, and endurance. The Atlantic's earlier turbulence felt distant, replaced by meditation and soft anticipation, a lull in both body and mind. Yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck with history pressing against him. The night deepened across river and deck, soft shadows folding in on themselves, merging reflection and memory into quiet contemplation. Sailors moved with gentle purpose, attending instruments, adjusting lines and observing horizon, water, and sky with calm presence. Officers maintained guidance, consultation, and oversight, their quiet steps and whispers blending into the rhythm of stillness. Smoke curled lazily into cool night air, carrying scent, reflection, and memory across decks and water. Below decks, hum of engines and machinery provided steady pulse, comforting and reliable, reinforcing order above. Sailors exchanged soft nods, low words, and thoughtful glances, sustaining connection through quiet awareness. Each ripple of water, shift of light, and whisper of wind became part of the reflective cadence aboard ship. The soft interplay of thought, memory, and duty created an unspoken meditation, a collective pause among men suspended in limbo. Every motion, gesture, and breath was deliberate, careful, and gentle, maintaining equilibrium in uncertainty. And yet their captain bore the greatest weight, alone upon the deck, with history pressing against him. Captain Langsdorff walked slowly along the bridge, the soft creak of deck beneath his boots mingling with the gentle lap of water against the hull. His eyes traced the horizon, the city, and the harbor's edges, each detail absorbing him in quiet meditation and subtle calculation. Thoughts of duty, honor, and consequence weighed heavily, pressing against fatigue and the long hours of decision-making. Sailors moved with measured calm, aware of his presence, yet absorbed in routine, unaware of the inner turbulence above. Smoke curled gently from the stacks, caught in a soft breeze, weaving into the warm hues of fading sunlight. Below decks, engines hummed steadily, a pulse beneath the reflective stillness, reinforcing continuity amid uncertainty. The distant hum of the city, the gentle lapping of water, and the soft flutter of flags created a rhythm that mirrored thought, deliberate and slow. Each calculation, every measure, carried significance beyond the immediate, echoing into future days and untold consequences. Even the subtle shimmer of light on steel seemed to draw attention to the weight of choice inherent in command. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. Langsdorff leaned lightly against the railing, feeling the slight sway beneath his feet, a rhythm he had come to know intimately over months at sea. Officers approached with quiet respect, speaking in hushed tones about provisions, positions, and international law, their words soft yet laden with urgency. The harbour seemed patient, the water holding a calm reflection that contrasted sharply with the storm of decision within him. Sailors below traced instruments and logs, maintaining machinery with gentle focus, unaware of the layers of thought above that determined the ship's destiny. Flags whispered in the wind, each ripple a subtle reminder of identity, duty, and consequence. Sunlight shifted slowly, casting elongated shadows across deck and water, blending intensity with gentle reflection. Every step, gesture, and glance became deliberate, a meditation in both observation and restraint. Langsdorff considered internment, the risk of engagement, and the honor of choice, the scales tipping slowly with thought, experience, and circumstance. Each option carried weight, not only for himself, but for the men who trusted, followed, and relied upon him. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. The ship rested softly in the harbour, her steel reflecting the muted colours of dusk, waves lapping gently against bow and sides. Sailors moved quietly, performing tasks with habitual grace, their attention absorbed in the familiar cadence of life aboard. Langsdorff traced lines on a chart, his gaze flickering between map, horizon, and harbour, each point a subtle argument in the calculus of choice. Below decks, machinery hummed consistently, a heartbeat beneath the reflective stillness, anchoring thought and maintaining rhythm. Officers whispered guidance and observation, careful to preserve calm, while balancing necessity with human emotion. Smoke drifted slowly, mingling with evening air, softening edges of deck and harbour alike. Even the distant call of gulls or faint shuffle along piers seemed to echo his internal deliberation. Sailors, unaware of the depth of choice above, moved in gentle rhythm, a quiet testament to trust and routine. The world beyond Montevideo remained calm, patient, and indifferent, yet every decision bore weight beyond the harbour's still surface. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. Light shifted subtly across decks, reflecting warm gold and muted grey along steel, water, and smoke. Langsdorff considered each option with methodical care, his mind moving across scenarios like a slow, deliberate tide. Sailors traced rails, adjusted ropes, and moved with practiced calm, their presence a stabilizing force against internal turbulence. Officers whispered notes, observing subtle currents of wind, water, and port activity, integrating all into the quiet framework of decision. Below decks, engines hummed, instruments clicked softly, and machinery moved with patient consistency, grounding the ship's rhythm in reality. The Atlantic's distant memory lingered, gentle waves folding into the reflective river, softening each thought with calm repetition. Sailors paused occasionally to watch reflection and horizon, drawing silent comfort from rhythm and light. Every breath, step, and glance became part of an intricate meditation, a dance between duty, anticipation, and the inevitability of choice. Even shadows along railings and hull seemed to stretch thoughtfully, marking the passage of time and pressure. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. Langsdorff moved among officers, whispering counsel and listening to reports, yet remaining detached, absorbed in his own contemplation. Sailors observed quietly, maintaining both discipline and calm, unaware of the deeper currents at play. The gentle lapping of water against hull and the soft flutter of flags seemed to echo the cadence of thought, slow and deliberate. Smoke drifted across deck, mingling with shifting light, reflecting both tension and serenity. Below decks, engines hummed, crew maintaining precision, rhythm and care, a quiet heartbeat beneath the unfolding contemplation. Sailors shared low words of reflection and reassurance, reinforcing trust in each other, and the vessel, light and shadow, played across the water, hull and railings, a subtle mirror of choice and consequence. Each whisper, glance, and gesture became part of the meditative rhythm of command and anticipation. The harbour seemed to breathe with the ship, patient yet aware, holding space for reflection, calculation, and inevitability. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. The evening deepened, cool air carrying faint scents of salt, metal, and distant streets, softening all edges of thought. Sailors traced familiar steps, adjusted lines, and observed reflections, grounding themselves in routine and presence. Officers consulted quietly, balancing patience, law, and subtle urgency in every word and gesture. Langsdorff's gaze shifted across water, city, and horizon, tracing possibilities with quiet intensity, weighing consequence with steady calm. Smoke curled lazily into the twilight, caught in soft arcs, mingling with fading light, reflections, and shadow. Below decks, engines hummed, instruments maintained, and machinery moved with quiet consistency, anchoring presence in habitual rhythm. Sailors exchanged muted gestures, low words, and gentle nods, sustaining equilibrium in a limbo of duty and observation. Each ripple on water, each shift of wind, and each subtle movement became a measured note in the unfolding quiet tension. Even the fading glow of sun seemed to pause, honoring the weight of thought, patience, and resolve. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. The river mirrored last traces of sunlight, soft gold fading into calm grey, the harbour quiet yet attentive. Sailors paused, hands resting lightly on rails, observing water, horizon, and deck with subtle reflection. Officers whispered guidance, consulted maps, and passed quiet observations, preserving calm and measured awareness. Smoke rose gently, curling with wind and light, softening both space and time around deck and ship. Langsdorff stood alone, contemplating honor, choice, and the impossible paths before him, absorbing the rhythm of river and wind. Below, engines hummed and machinery moved steadily, grounding both thought and presence in ritualized continuity. Every gesture, glance, and breath was deliberate, harmonizing with the subtle cadence of decision and reflection. The harbour held the ship with gentle patience, acknowledging the weight and inevitability of human deliberation. Sailors and officers alike felt the quiet tension, the gentle anticipation that drew the day toward inevitable resolution. And as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. Shadows deepened across decks and river, folding light and reflection into soft gradients of grey and silver. Sailors moved deliberately, maintaining routine, observing calm, and preserving gentle awareness. Officers whispered counsel and monitored subtle shifts, integrating law, diplomacy, and human consequence into measured attention. The Atlantic's distant memory echoed softly, waves folding into rhythm, reflection, and thought. Smoke drifted into cool night air, mingling with metallic warmth and fading sunlight, softening intensity into meditation. Langsdorff considered each path, weighing duty, honor, and sacrifice. With quiet, deliberate care, below deck's crew maintained instruments, engines, and machinery, with steady rhythm, reinforcing continuity amid uncertainty. Every step, gesture, and breath became part of the slow orchestration of decision, reflection, and inevitability. The harbour seemed suspended, holding stillness and awareness, patience and pressure, calm and consequence, and as the deadline drew near, his course became both inevitable and tragic. Graf Spee eased away from Montevideo harbour with quiet dignity, the river reflecting long shadows of masts, hull, and flags as she moved steadily into open water. Sailors leaned lightly on rails, eyes tracing the gentle waves and distant city, their thoughts a mixture of duty, reflection, and subdued farewell. On the docks, crowds gathered silently, their murmurs soft against the backdrop of water and wind, observing the ship's slow departure with curiosity and respect. Smoke from the stacks drifted lazily into the late afternoon sky, mingling with the salt breeze, painting gentle gradients across deck and water. Officers conferred quietly, their words deliberate and measured, preserving calm amid the unspoken tension of the moment. Even the light shimmered on the hull in patterns that suggested both passage and reflection, softening edges, blending shadow and warmth. Sailors below decks maintained rhythm, checked machinery, and performed small tasks with gentle focus, a grounding presence beneath the quiet spectacle above. Each ripple along the hull carried memory, anticipation, and the subtle weight of finality. The harbour seemed to exhale, holding both anticipation and resignation in its reflective stillness. What followed was not a battle, but a farewell. The wind stirred lightly, rustling flags, carrying whispers of the city, and brushing gently across decks and rails. Sailors paused to absorb the soft cadence of movement, the sway of the ship, and the gentle rhythm of water against hull. Officers observed the horizon, weighing distance, tides, and currents, their quiet calculations woven into the slow forward motion. Smoke traced arcs into the sky, curling and dissolving, like thoughts released into the open, mingling with fading light. Below decks, engines hummed steadily, a heartbeat anchoring attention and presence through gentle consistency. Sailors exchanged small nods and brief words, maintaining connection and morale, anchoring themselves in ritual and routine. Light reflected across water, hull and distant piers, blending day into evening in soft gradients. Even the faint footsteps on the quay echoed the rhythm of time passing, muted and measured. Each small movement, gesture and reflection contributed to the slow contemplative unfolding of departure, and what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. The river opened gradually into broader Atlantic waters, soft waves carrying Graf Spee with deliberate elegance into distance. Sailors traced the horizon with calm eyes, noting shifts of wind, light, and reflection across deck and water. Officers continued their subtle navigation, their whispers weaving together strategy, anticipation, and careful calculation. Smoke mingled with salt-laden air, softening contours of deck, sky, and water into gentle gradients of gold, grey, and silver. Below decks, engines hummed with steady rhythm, crew maintaining machinery with careful attention to continuity and safety. Sailors exchanged quiet glances, a shared understanding of duty, uncertainty, and the rare intimacy of leaving port under such circumstances. The city faded slowly behind them, lights and movement, dissolving into soft memory, reflected faintly on the gentle waves. Even gulls traced lazy arcs overhead, their flight measured, a delicate accompaniment to the ship's own motion. Each breath, step, and observation became part of a meditative rhythm aboard ship, a blend of presence and reflection, and what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. Shadows lengthened across decks as the sun descended toward horizon, blending water, hull, and smoke into muted silhouettes. Sailors moved with calm attention, tracing lines, checking instruments, and adjusting ropes with quiet precision. Officers conferred softly, mindful of tide, distance, and diplomacy, maintaining equilibrium through subtle guidance. The harbour's memory lingered, a gentle hum in the background, carried in reflections, ripples, and faint echoes of footsteps along quays. Smoke drifted slowly, curling with wind, blending warmth and coolness in a tranquil dance across the decks. Below decks, machinery hummed steadily, grounding thought, movement, and observation in continuity. Sailors reflected quietly, recalling ports visited, distant faces, and homes they longed to see again. The gentle rocking of the ship, the soft lap of water against the hull, and the sigh of wind created a rhythm that eased tension. Each gesture, glance, and breath carried weight, history, and soft emotion, harmonized in stillness and attention. And what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. The sea expanded into distance, merging horizon and sky in subtle shades of grey and silver. The ship's motion, measured and deliberate. Sailors paused, resting hands lightly on rails, absorbing reflection, wind, and the soft, steady cadence of water beneath them. Officers whispered quietly, consulting charts, sharing observations, and guiding with measured patience, preserving calm among crew. Smoke rose lazily, curling and dissolving, carrying scent, warmth, and quiet memory across deck and air. Below decks, engines and machinery hummed a steady pulse, a grounding rhythm to sustain the ship's slow, deliberate course. Sailors exchanged subdued smiles and soft words, a delicate recognition of shared experience and the subtle intimacy of anticipation. Light reflected in gentle ripples across steel and water, blending color, shadow, and distance into soft contemplation. Even distant sounds from shore carried muted, measured significance, threading observation into reflection. Every motion, glance, and breath was deliberate, part of a meditative rhythm sustained by thought, presence, and quiet awareness. And what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. The sky deepened into dusky shades, casting subtle silver and soft grey across water and hull, blurring the line between reflection and reality. Sailors leaned against railings, tracing gentle arcs of wind, wave, and movement, integrating awareness with calm observation. Officers maintained quiet consultation, speaking in low tones about course, tide, and time. Their words harmonized with the lull of river and sea. Smoke drifted gently, reflecting light and dissolving into air, softening intensity and blending observation into meditation. Below decks, machinery hummed steadily, crew attending with gentle precision to continuity, rhythm, and order. Sailors shared brief nods and low words, a quiet connection woven into the slow cadence of departure. Light shifted subtly, reflections rippling over water, steel, and distant piers, tracing time in motion, memory, and presence. Even the faint whisper of wind over rigging seemed to echo the tempo of thought, consideration, and quiet farewell. Every breath, gesture, and step became part of a deliberate rhythm, a shared meditation across deck, crew, and ship. And what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. Graf Spee glided farther into the Atlantic, her bow cutting smoothly through gentle waves, carrying her away from city, quay, and curiosity alike. Sailors observed horizon, light, and water with calm focus, tracing distance and movement in measured silence. Officers conferred quietly, integrating observation, law, and subtle strategy into each minor adjustment of course or speed. Smoke trailed softly from stacks, drifting with wind, blending with light and reflection, in gentle arcs across deck. Below, machinery hummed consistently, a grounding heartbeat beneath the reflective stillness above. Sailors exchanged low glances, soft words, and subtle gestures, sustaining awareness, trust, and quiet presence. Sunlight faded gradually, leaving silver and grey reflections on hull, water, and smoke, softening edges and memory alike. Each ripple, shadow, and breeze became part of the contemplative rhythm, a meditation in movement, thought, and quiet observation. Even the distant hum of city and harbour faded into gentle reflection, leaving only presence, duty, and calm. And what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. The Atlantic embraced Graf Spee, with gentle waves and endless horizon, stretching into distance. Soft and patient, sailors leaned lightly on railings, tracing the gentle sway beneath them, absorbing reflection, wind, and soft light in careful meditation. Officers whispered counsel in low tones, balancing calculation, observation, and quiet anticipation. Smoke drifted lazily across deck and water, curling and dissolving in harmony with fading light. Below decks, engines hummed steadily, instruments moved with precision, and machinery maintained rhythm, grounding both crew and vessel in quiet certainty. Sailors exchanged subtle gestures of recognition, sharing presence, memory, and reflection in measured silence. Light rippled across water, hull, and distant horizon, blending calm, movement, and reflection into a tranquil whole. Each breath, step, and gesture was deliberate, harmonized with thought, observation, and the gentle progression of time. Even as city, harbour, and crowd fell away into memory, the ship carried presence, calm, and awareness forward, and what followed was not a battle, but a farewell. Graf Spee's hull rested against the shallow sand, still and silent, yet the flames rising from her decks painted the horizon with vivid light. Soft yet relentless, sailors moved with careful purpose, tending to small tasks, checking ropes, and preserving life even as the fire transformed familiar steel into an unpredictable glow. Smoke curled upward, dissolving slowly into wind and sky, carrying the scent of heat, metal, and salt, mingling with evening air. The water reflected flickering light, turning gentle waves into dancing mirrors of orange, gold, and soft grey. Officers stood quietly among sailors, observing, guiding, and maintaining calm, a subtle rhythm of discipline amid the extraordinary. The distant hills of Montevideo held silent witness, the city's lights muted against the dramatic transformation of ship and horizon. Even the gentle lap of waves along hull and sand seemed to echo the slow, deliberate inevitability of the moment. Each reflection, ripple, and whisper of wind became part of a measured cadence, a meditation in presence, observation, and acceptance. Sailors exchanged quiet glances, understanding both the gravity and the surreal beauty of the moment. But even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. Flames danced along decks and masts, licking metal with slow, deliberate hunger, casting long shadows across sailors' faces and water. Smoke mingled with twilight, softening light, blending color, and carrying memory into air and horizon alike. Sailors moved carefully through heat and reflection, checking lines, keeping engines and mechanisms secure, maintaining rhythm even in transformation. Officers whispered instructions, low and steady, blending guidance, observation, and reassurance into the gentle chaos of fire and light. The harbour lay behind them, quiet and patient, the city observing, without intrusion, distant and reflective. Waves lapped softly against hull and sand, carrying scent, heat, and sound across river and sea, integrating all into the rhythm of the evening. Sailors shared low words of reflection and presence, hands brushing steel, eyes tracing light, wind and horizon. In careful meditation, the fire, intense yet contained, illuminated subtle features of deck, mast and water in fleeting patterns of orange and silver. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath, accepting the slow transformation of ship and steel into memory and reflection. And yet, even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. Smoke drifted lazily, bending with wind and subtle currents, forming arcs that dissolved into the softening dusk. Sailors moved gently, mindful of each step, each glance, each small gesture, as they preserved order and continuity amidst extraordinary circumstance. Officers remained close, guiding, observing, and ensuring that calm persisted, even as bright tongues of flame marked the passage of inevitability. The water carried reflections, shifting light across gentle ripples, integrating fire, hull and horizon into quiet motion. Below decks, machinery had slowed, quieted and stabilized, a final heartbeat of presence beneath the spectacle above. Sailors paused in reflection, drawing calm from routine, habit, and shared observation, anchoring themselves in both ritual and immediacy. Each breath of wind, each flicker of flame, each ripple along hull and shore became part of a deliberate, meditative rhythm. Even distant sounds, gulls, waves, or faint city life, interwove into a quiet chorus, soft and reflective. The glow on water, steel and smoke seemed to stretch time, slowing perception and drawing attention inward. But even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. The final timbers and decks began to soften in flame and heat, steel bending subtly, wood surrendering slowly to fire and wind. Sailors maintained presence, observation, and care, moving with deliberate calm through the luminous haze. Officers whispered, consulted, and guided, their movements a measured counterpoint to unpredictable light and smoke. Water mirrored the glow, shifting with gentle tides and wind, creating patterns that seemed alive with quiet energy. Smoke drifted upward in gentle spirals, dissolving into evening air, carrying memory, scent, and reflection into distance. Sailors exchanged low words and nods, sustaining trust and awareness in a time of extraordinary transformation. Even the gentle ripple of waves, lapping against hull and sand, became a soft companion to thought and observation. Light reflected across decks, masts, and distant horizon in a slow, hypnotic cadence, merging presence, meditation, and acceptance. Every gesture, step, and glance seemed part of an unspoken rhythm, deliberate, calm, and reflective. And yet, even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. Orange and gold softened into smoke and shadow as fire consumed the upper structures, leaving steel darkened and warm under fading light. Sailors moved with deliberate care, tracing lines, adjusting equipment, maintaining connection to ship, each other, and moment. Officers guided with quiet assurance, speaking in low tones that blended reflection, calculation, and reassurance. The harbour lay silent behind them, distant yet present, a subtle witness to slow, deliberate transformation. Waves reflected flickers of fire in gentle, undulating patterns, merging motion, light, and observation into a hypnotic rhythm. Smoke mingled with the evening breeze, carrying soft scent and memory across deck, water, and horizon. Sailors shared brief words, nods, and gestures, sustaining calm, trust, and awareness in a moment that was both surreal and intimate. Light shifted gradually, reflecting orange, silver, and grey across steel, water and smoke, softening edges and time alike. Even distant sounds carried measured significance, weaving together presence, reflection, and meditation into one coherent rhythm. But even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. The river and harbour slowly dissolved into open water, the ship's form succumbing to flame and tide, gentle yet inexorable. Sailors traced lines of reflection on decks and waves, breathing slowly, hands brushing steel, eyes absorbing horizon, wind, and light. Officers observed quietly, guiding, instructing, and maintaining calm, careful to preserve presence above the extraordinary transformation. Smoke rose in long, soft arcs, carrying warmth, scent, and quiet memory into twilight and air. Water reflected fire in gentle ripples, casting slow patterns that blended horizon, steel, and sky. Below decks, engines and instruments had quieted to subtle hums, sustaining rhythm and grounding thought in gentle continuity. Sailors paused, considering distance, light, and movement, finding calm in measured observation and shared presence. Every flicker of flame, ripple of water, and whisper of wind became part of a hypnotic cadence, deliberate and reflective. Even the sky, softening from orange to grey, seemed to absorb the moment with patience and quiet grace. And yet, even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. Shadows deepened over water, flames softened into glowing embers, and smoke stretched into the cool evening air. Sailors moved carefully, maintaining lines, observing and reflecting on the extraordinary sight with calm attention. Officers whispered guidance in low tones, preserving ritual, order, and quiet understanding among crew. Light shimmered across water, smoke, and steel, slow and deliberate, inviting reflection and meditation. Waves lapped softly, carrying faint scent, warmth, and the rhythm of passing time across hull and horizon. Sailors exchanged subtle gestures, low words, and silent acknowledgement, sustaining presence and focus amid transience. Each ripple, reflection, and breath became a part of a slow, deliberate cadence, linking mind, body, and observation to moment and memory. The Atlantic embraced fire, smoke, and steel, softening intensity into meditation, memory, and continuity. Even as Graf Spee surrendered herself to tide and flame, her presence lingered in thought, reflection, and story. But even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. The night embraced water, smoke, and embers, folding horizon, ship, and reflection into quiet grey and silver. Sailors moved gently, maintaining observation, ritual, and calm. Hands brushing steel, eyes tracing gentle ripples and fading light. Officers guided with quiet patience, integrating presence, reflection, and subtle calculation in every motion. Smoke drifted into the cool night, carrying scent, warmth, and memory across water and deck. Waves reflected soft embers in slow undulation, merging horizon, flame, and steel into gentle rhythm. Sailors shared brief glances, subtle gestures, and low words, sustaining trust, reflection, and awareness in a moment, suspended in time. Every flicker, ripple, and breath became part of a deliberate, hypnotic cadence, slow and measured, attentive to movement, light, and sound. Even distant city and harbour seemed absorbed, patient and silent, acknowledging both passing and memory. Each detail, the glow, the reflection, the sway, wove together meditation, awareness, and quiet remembrance. And yet, even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. The embers faded, smoke dissolved into night, and waves carried steel and memory gently into horizon. Sailors paused in observation, tracing soft reflections, gentle ripples, and the subtle cadence of wind and water. Officers remained close, whispering low guidance, preserving calm continuity and attentive presence. Light shifted into quiet grey, blending steel, water, and horizon into one soft reflective whole. Waves lapped steadily, a slow pulse beneath fading embers and dissipating smoke, marking time with gentle precision. Sailors exchanged subdued gestures and words, maintaining connection, awareness, and meditation in the stillness. Every breath, glance, and step became part of an unspoken rhythm, deliberate, calm, and attentive to passing moment. Even the night, soft and patient, seemed to hold space for reflection, observation, and memory. All around, water, steel, and sky merged into quiet meditation, presence, and reflection. But even as her hull sank, the story of Graf Spee was not over. Captain Hans Langsdorff walked quietly through the streets of Buenos Aires, the evening light soft on cobblestones and rooftops, carrying both weight and stillness in each step. His thoughts traced the journey of Graf Spee, the decisions made, and the lives touched along the way, moving slowly through memory like a gentle tide. The city around him hummed faintly with distant voices, carriage wheels, and the soft stir of evening wind through trees and avenues. He paused for a moment, observing light reflected in windows and puddles, tracing subtle patterns in shadow, contemplating honor, duty, and the quiet cost of choice. Letters, maps, and words whispered from his cabin at Montevideo floated in memory, reminders of responsibility and impossible options. His hands rested lightly on railings and gates, grounding thought and presence with each small touch. Sailors' faces, both known and remembered, flickered across memory like soft reflections on water, gentle, fleeting, and significant. Even the distant river murmured quietly, a reminder of the passage from conflict to consequence, moving inevitably toward reflection. Each step seemed deliberate, measured, part of a rhythm drawn from honor, duty, and thought. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. Inside his modest quarters, Langsdorff sat with pen and paper, the lamp casting soft golden pools of light across desk and walls. His letter unfolded slowly, careful in phrasing, calm in tone, explaining decisions taken, lives considered, and responsibilities acknowledged. Every word was deliberate, weighted with thought, conscious of history, reflection, and quiet conscience. Outside, the evening deepened, shadows stretching across streets and distant rooftops, blending memory, presence, and time into a meditative rhythm. Sailors and officers, friends and acquaintances, moved gently through recollection and thought in his mind, present though distant, like soft reflections on calm water. The hum of the city, the distant river, and the rustle of trees created a backdrop for thought, steady and gentle, anchoring presence and intention. Each line written became part of a quiet ritual, a methodical integration of action, honor, and reflection. The lamp flickered softly, wind brushing through open windows, carrying scent, warmth, and the subtle sense of time passing. Pen in hand, he observed the world with calm attention, tracing memory, consequence, and honor in deliberate rhythm. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. Langsdorff paused, gazing toward the distant river, reflecting on waters once traversed by Graf Spee, and still alive in memory, sailors' laughter, the subtle creak of decks, and faint whispers of wind over hull and rigging floated through thought, like gentle, distant echoes. He reflected on the lives spared, the courage witnessed, and the quiet perseverance of crews on both sides, drawing solace in measured contemplation. Letters unopened, messages unspoken, and the soft expectation of consequence hung in air and mind alike. Outside, night deepened, soft lights glimmering across streets, rooftops, and river in patterns, subtle and hypnotic. His hands traced edges of paper, feeling texture and weight, grounding thought and reflection in tactile reality. Every breath, movement, and thought merged into a slow cadence, deliberate, reflective, and meditative. He considered duty not as command alone, but as continuous awareness, moral presence, and quiet responsibility. Even distant sounds, footsteps, wind, the river, wove into a gentle reflective rhythm of presence and meditation. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. The city remained soft, quiet, and patient as Langsdorff rose and moved toward contemplation, tracing walls, doors, and streets in careful meditation. Thoughts of crew, city, harbor, and horizon, intertwined with reflections on honor, mortality, and consequence, forming a delicate pattern in mind. He paused, absorbing shadows stretching across pavement and distant water, reflecting subtle transitions between presence, memory, and inevitability. Light from distant lamps mingled with the fading orange of sunset, softening edges of reality and memory alike. Letters lay on desk, a tangible archive of thought, choice, and reflection, carefully ordered, deliberate, and calm. Each movement and gesture was measured, small but deliberate, a meditation in presence and responsibility. Sailors' voices and laughter echoed softly in memory, mingling with distant river murmurs and gentle evening wind. Every heartbeat, glance, and sigh became part of a rhythm, slow, hypnotic, and reflective. Even the faint scent of wood, lamp oil, and evening air carried weight, memory, and soft significance. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. As night deepened, Langsdorff's thoughts traced memory of battle, river, and port, observing each with quiet, deliberate attention. He considered the balance between life and duty, responsibility and consequence, presence and honor, slow and steady in unfolding. The river whispered in soft undertones, carrying reflection, memory, and gentle reminders of past choices across time and distance. Officers and sailors passed through recollection, faces and gestures remembered with clarity yet softened by calm reflection. Paper, pen, and lamp created a deliberate space for thought, reflection, and quiet conscience, steadying rhythm and presence. Shadows deepened across floor, wall, and window, blending thought, presence, and light into slow meditation. Every step, movement, and breath was deliberate, measured, and reflective, anchored in thought and awareness. Even distant murmurs of city life wove into a calm, hypnotic cadence, carrying reflection, presence, and inevitability. Memory, responsibility, and quiet moral presence merged into a single, deliberate rhythm. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. Letters completed, Langsdorff rested, hands folded lightly, absorbing silence, reflection, and subtle rhythm of night. The distant river reflected moonlight and soft glimmers from the city, merging movement, shadow, and meditation. Sailors and officers floated in memory, present in thought, forming a quiet chorus of past presence and responsibility. Each soft gust of wind through trees, distant footstep, or gentle ripple on water became part of the deliberate rhythm of reflection. Shadows and light stretched, mingled and dissolved into soft grey, anchoring attention in observation and meditation. Thoughts traced Graf Spee, harbour, and horizon, moving slowly across memory, like water over smooth stone. Every breath, gesture, and pause reinforced meditation, presence, and quiet acceptance. Even the lamp flicker seemed to echo measured, deliberate thought, blending observation, reflection, and calm. Each sensation, memory, and rhythm merged into a hypnotic cadence of honor, choice, and consequence. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. Langsdorff moved slowly through room and corridor, observing night, shadow, and subtle light. Tracing calm patterns in thought and presence, he reflected on crew, city, and harbour, each memory a soft pulse in the rhythm of consequence and duty. Shadows merged into silence, and wind carried faint scent of water, oil, and wood, integrating observation with reflection. Sailors and officers lingered in memory, gestures and words softened by calm, deliberate meditation. Every step, glance, and breath was measured, blending movement, thought, and quiet honor into one continuous cadence. The river, distant and patient, mirrored subtle light and shadow, grounding reflection in movement and rhythm. Paper, pen, and thought formed a deliberate arc of communication, conscience and memory anchored in responsibility. Even distant city murmurs and faint echoes of streets carried gentle significance in the overall cadence of thought. Presence, memory, and honor intertwined in slow, hypnotic rhythm, steadying mind, body, and soul. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. The city slept softly under a pale moon, streets and river muted, absorbing memory, reflection, and quiet presence. Langsdorff sat at a table, pen in hand, revisiting subtle lines of thought, presence, and deliberate intention. Shadows lengthened across floor, wall, and desk, blending night, light, and memory into a meditative whole. Sailors, officers, and crew lingered in reflection, their presence carried gently in thought, soft and patient. Even distant rustle of trees, gentle murmur of water, and faint hum of city combined into a rhythm, slow, deliberate, and reflective. Every breath, gesture, and movement became part of a hypnotic cadence, integrating thought, honor, and quiet moral presence. Memory traced river, harbor, and horizon, folding past into present in calm meditative arcs. Light, shadow, and air combined to carry reflection, awareness, and subtle acceptance of consequence. Presence, thought, and rhythm intertwined into deliberate meditation, quiet and slow realization. One man's decision had ended the hunt, but its echoes rippled far beyond his life. News of Graf Spee's fate spread slowly at first, carried by ships, telegraphs, and radio waves, weaving its way across oceans and cities with quiet insistence. Newspapers printed lines of text that shimmered in lamplight across bedrooms, offices, and cafes, their words carrying wonder, relief, and curiosity. Sailors and civilians alike paused in reflection, tracing distant waters in imagination, sensing the drama unfold far from their own familiar shores. Governments issued statements, careful in tone, blending diplomacy, triumph, and observation into deliberate messaging. The newsrooms hummed softly as editors and journalists shaped narrative with steady hands, merging fact, interpretation, and reflection into measured cadence. Citizens read quietly, sipping tea or coffee, windows open to the evening wind, carrying distant sound, scent, and reflection into rooms. Even in distant ports, watchmen and sailors exchanged soft words, quietly absorbing victory, consequence, and the rhythms of memory. The river of information flowed gentle yet deliberate, integrating distance, perception, and awareness across continents. Every sentence read became part of a meditative reflection on the vastness of sea, consequence, and human effort. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. In London, streets carried a softer light as people read telegrams and listened to radio bulletins, the hum of daily life interspersed with hushed reflection. Offices, homes, and cafes held a quiet focus as minds traced distant waters, ships, and crews, imagining every ripple, mast, and horizon. Sailors' faces were imagined on decks far away, their courage noted in soft thought, distant yet immediate. Newspapers carried sketches, maps, and careful descriptions, framing perception as much as reporting fact, inviting contemplation and discussion. Admirals and officers in port reflected on the balance between strategy, fortune, and human skill. Their deliberations slow, deliberate, and measured. Even children reading aloud in warm rooms absorbed echoes of adventure, duty, and distant horizons, quiet curiosity, mingling with calm imagination. Each story told became part of a subtle rhythm, carrying attention, wonder, and reflection across time and space. The evening wind carried distant echoes of rivers, ports, and ships, mingling memory and awareness with present calm. Words and headlines moved through city, countryside, and port alike, gentle, deliberate, and hypnotic in their unfolding. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. Across the Atlantic, Berlin received news with quiet tension, shadows stretching along streets and plazas as people considered reality and expectation. Citizens read bulletins in soft lamplight, absorbing fact, rumor, and nuance, reflecting on distance, effort, and consequence. Government offices moved slowly, carefully, deliberating over words, statements, and reports. Conscious of audience perception and subtle diplomacy, sailors at distant docks paused in soft reflection, the scent of water and distant machinery mingling with thought. Even the evening wind carried weight, stirring curtains, trees, and memory as streets and riverbanks absorbed the unfolding narrative. News reporters drafted and edited with deliberate calm, threading fact and implication into a coherent, reflective story. Readers traced lines on paper, imagined horizons, and the gentle movements of distant waves, ships, and steel. Each observation, reflection, and whisper of wind became part of a slow, hypnotic rhythm, integrating thought and presence. Governments considered response, honor, and impression, careful to balance history, diplomacy, and public perception. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. Ports around the world buzzed quietly with reaction, the soft clatter of rope and footsteps mingling with hushed conversations about distant waters. Sailors and merchants reflected on possibility, courage, and skill, recalling their own experiences as they imagined life aboard ship. Telegrams, letters, and reports created a steady flow of awareness across oceans, soft yet deliberate, integrating distant action into present understanding. Newsrooms, offices, and cafes absorbed the quiet rhythm, translating movement, consequence, and observation into meditative attention. Windows reflected fading sunlight, evening lamps, and distant shadows, softening perception and blending imagination with memory. Even the gentle lapping of water at piers became part of a subtle cadence, marking time, motion, and reflection in continuous rhythm. Children and adults alike imagined waves, masts, and horizons, soft curiosity threading through calm observation. Each headline, paragraph, and dispatch contributed to perception, shaping morale, reflection, and understanding across continents. Sailors' faces, officers' gestures, and distant riverbanks moved through thought, like gentle ripples on reflective water. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. Morale among Allied forces lifted quietly but noticeably, officers noting the careful balance between tactical success and human consequence. Soldiers on distant shores absorbed the news in gentle reflection, considering strategy, chance, and courage in a rhythm slow and meditative. Messages reached ships at sea, carrying soft reassurance, awareness, and contemplative victory across ocean and horizon. Even in quiet moments aboard vessel or in barracks, the sense of collective achievement spread through attention to distant action. Ships rocked gently with tide, wind, and time, as sailors traced history and consequence in their minds, feeling presence in absence. Every telegram and report wove observation, memory, and consequence into deliberate, hypnotic cadence. Citizens reading newspapers absorbed distant courage and skill as part of a continuous narrative that blended wonder, reflection, and calm. Officers discussed quietly, weighing impact, perception, and subtle diplomacy, their voices low, measured, and intentional. Shadows lengthened across walls, piers, and decks, softening perception, marking time, and merging memory with awareness. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. Germany felt embarrassment ripple gently through streets, offices, and quiet homes, citizens absorbing the reality with restrained reflection. Statements, speeches, and news carried careful tone, deliberate pacing, and measured expression, softening tension, yet acknowledging consequence. Sailors at ports, still in thought from recent missions, reflected on action, result, and moral weight, with steady awareness. Across continents, readers, listeners, and observers integrated distant action into reflection, tracing river, sea, and horizon in imagination. Telegrams and bulletins carried subtle rhythm, attention, and awareness into homes, offices, and ports, linking presence, consequence, and calm perception. Each ripple of news, each exchange of word became part of the gentle cadence of understanding, reflection, and observation. Citizens and soldiers alike absorbed subtle moral lessons, courage and consequence, threading awareness through quiet meditation. Even the faint wind along streets, riverbanks, and docks mingled memory, thought, and soft reflection. News became ritual, reflection, and rhythm, integrating distant action into quiet observation and consciousness. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. In the Americas, readers followed the story with gentle fascination, curiosity, and reflective attention, imagining waves, hulls, and sailors' quiet courage. Newsrooms transmitted updates slowly, integrating precision, calm, and narrative into reflective cadence for readers near and far. Sailors, officers, and civilians exchanged quiet impressions, thoughts, and subtle gestures of shared understanding across distance and time. Every line read became part of meditation, presence, and reflection, moving mind and imagination across oceans and rivers alike. The soft lapping of water, distant murmur of traffic, and gentle evening wind blended into calm rhythm, supporting thought, observation, and imagination. Newspapers carried accounts of courage, strategy, and consequence, blending measured fact with soft interpretation and reflective cadence. Citizens considered distant horizon, riverbanks, and steel hulls, imagining presence and reflection in meditative attention. Words and perception became intertwined, forming a gentle hypnotic cadence across continents and waters, integrating memory and observation. Each story shared, whispered or read, carried calm reflection, attention, and soft understanding through homes, ports, and streets. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. Soft light fell across continents, cities, and ports, as the world absorbed the story with reflection, attention, and quiet fascination. Sailors and civilians carried awareness of Graf Spee's journey, surrender, and legacy into thought, memory, and imagination. Governments, editors, and officers reflected on consequence, perception, and subtle diplomacy with measured, deliberate calm. The river and horizon remained in memory, distant yet present, tracing gentle lines of courage, honor, and outcome. Even distant lamps, rivers, and quiet streets carried sense of time, rhythm, and reflective meditation. Each reflection, ripple, and word became part of a hypnotic cadence, blending presence, observation, and gentle understanding. Citizens imagined sails, decks, and soft light on water, tracing distant action in slow, meditative thought. News became shared rhythm, observation, and reflection, integrating distant horizon, steel, and wind into awareness. Evening carried gentle whispers of river, city, and thought, soft and patient, threading memory and perception into calm. And in this victory of perception, the war at sea took a subtle yet decisive turn. The waters off Uruguay held a quiet secret, a silhouette resting beneath gentle waves, a whisper of steel and memory. Divers descended slowly, feeling the pressure of time and water, tracing shapes softened by salt, current, and shadow. Each fragment of metal carried story, each curve and seam, a reminder of lives lived, decisions made, and paths traced across distant oceans. The ocean breathed slowly around the wreck, light filtering down in shifting patterns, illuminating remnants of masts, hull, and railings. Fish wove through openings, curious and gentle, brushing past history in their soft, fluid rhythm. Even the faint scent of salt and wet steel seemed to carry memory, mingling with quiet awareness in the deep. Historians and enthusiasts observed in reverent stillness, speaking in hushed tones, letting presence and thought mingle with the water's calm cadence. Time itself seemed slower here, measured not by clock or calendar, but by tide, current, and reflection. Every shadowed corner, every bent plate, told a story without urgency or violence. Beneath the tides her story sleeps, but on the surface it still whispers. Divers moved gently through corridors of shadow and rust, aware of the delicate silence surrounding history's echo. Light shimmered across uneven surfaces, refracting into slow, meditative patterns, guiding attention through silent halls. Tools and fins stirred water with whispering currents, each movement measured, deliberate, and respectful. Relics lay scattered, anchors, propellers, and fragments of life, each carrying weight, context, and reflection. Observers imagined the crew moving, footsteps soft, voices quiet yet purposeful, each action threading into memory. Even the current seemed aware, brushing past metal, carrying sediment and soft echoes of past presence. Photographs and sketches recorded shape and shadow, translating ocean, light, and history into calm understanding. Each moment spent at the wreck became meditation, attention merging with curiosity, history, and quiet reflection. The Atlantic, patient and enduring, cradled memory in its rhythm, steady and eternal. Beneath the tides her story sleeps, but on the surface it still whispers. Above water, the horizon held gentle light, soft reflections on waves, carrying distance and memory to shore. Boats drifted silently, oars resting, motors idling, while those aboard allowed stillness to enter thought. The story of Graf Spee stretched across oceans, from shipyard to Montevideo, from battle to wreck, tracing gentle lines of consequence. Observers imagined sailors' faces, young and old, threading courage, thought, and responsibility into each action on distant decks. The wind moved softly across the water, rippling reflections, caressing memory, and carrying whispers of the past. Even gulls above seemed to pause, circling in quiet arcs, as if respecting the history resting below. Every observation, every soft note of wind or water, became part of reflection, awareness and subtle meditation. Memories of the hunt, the chase, the city, and the river mingled with ocean and light in gentle arcs. Time and tide worked together to preserve, reveal, and quiet the echoes of presence. Beneath the tides, her story sleeps, but on the surface it still whispers. Artifacts recovered, laid gently on tables, anchors, navigation tools, and fragments of hull, each piece touched with reverence. Scholars and enthusiasts traced inscriptions, numbers, and marks, allowing observation to blend with calm reflection. Each object connected the present with distant moments of thought, duty, and quiet presence aboard steel decks. Light moved softly across surfaces, highlighting curves, corrosion, and memory, inviting attention and slow contemplation. The scent of salt, oil, and aged metal mixed with the gentle warmth of indoor air, forming a rhythm of calm, tactile awareness. Stories unfolded through touch and thought, linking imagination with historical fact, integrating past and present seamlessly. Conversation moved in hushed tones, soft voices weaving speculation, observation, and quiet reverence. Even the distant hum of water outside windows merged into rhythm with reflection, movement, and presence. Every piece, every shadow, every note of wind or tide became part of meditation on the passage of time. Beneath the tides, her story sleeps, but on the surface, it still whispers. Visitors traced paths along the deck, imagining waves, steel, and horizon in their own quiet cadence. Each step was deliberate, thoughtful, slow, a meditation on distance, consequence, and observation. Histories intertwined, sailors' bravery, captains' choices, global perception, and the quiet rhythm of time weaving together across oceans. Even the smallest fragment of metal, a hinge, a railing, or a fragment of plate, carried weight and presence. The tide outside continued its gentle motion, ebbing and flowing with hypnotic consistency, grounding thought and awareness. Sailors' movements, distant and imagined, mingled with observers' attention, creating a rhythm slow, reflective, and respectful. Shadows shifted gently across deck, water, and horizon, merging past, present, and imagination in quiet meditation. Each conversation, gesture, and breath became part of a slow, continuous cadence of calm reflection. The Atlantic held all this softly, patient, timeless, and observant. Beneath the tides, her story sleeps, but on the surface it still whispers. Dusk fell across harbor and ocean, light softening to amber, and then violet, blending sky, water, and memory. Gentle waves lapped against hulls, small boats, and distant piers, moving in steady, hypnotic rhythm. Historians traced lines of battle, charting positions, angles, and consequence with measured, deliberate attention. Even the wind carried sound and scent, blending reflection, salt, and presence into calm awareness. Each diver and observer moved slowly, letting observation merge with thought, imagination, and gentle meditation. Every fragment of Graf Spee, visible or imagined, became part of a continuous story, connecting history, ocean, and quiet reflection. Shadows deepened, light shimmered, and memory traced soft arcs across water, metal, and mind. Presence, thought, and history merged, each step in attention folding into a slow, meditative cadence. Even distant gulls and currents participated in the rhythm, carrying gentle echoes of the ship's life and quiet conclusion. Beneath the tides, her story sleeps, but on the surface it still whispers. Relics stored, divers returning to shore, observers quieted, leaving room for reflection, presence, and gentle thought. The Atlantic, patient and vast, seemed to absorb memory, shadow, and soft light into its slow hypnotic rhythm. Even the smallest detail, a twisted plate, a fragment of railing, a bent propeller, reminded the mind of life, action, and consequence. Historians and enthusiasts, left with slow steps, soft voices, and deliberate silence, carrying meditation and reflection with them. The horizon, distant and eternal, reflected moonlight, star, and occasional glow from the shore, blending observation with imagination. Each gentle wave, subtle light, and quiet wind contributed to rhythm, presence, and thought, linking past and present. Sailors' memories, captured in logs and letters, mingled with physical remnants, forming a bridge between reflection and tangible history. The Atlantic remained patient, constant, carrying memory, echo, and quiet meditation across its wide, enduring span. Each observer, diver, and scholar carried away gentle awareness, history, and calm, steady presence. Beneath the tides, her story sleeps, but on the surface, it still whispers. Softly, night settled across the horizon, harbor, and distant waters, leaving memory, presence, and reflection to flow in calm, measured rhythm. Every ripple, shadow, and glimmer of light on water became part of continuous meditation on the passage of time, lives, and consequence. Divers rested, observers reflected, and historians traced connections between presence and memory in hushed, deliberate awareness. The Atlantic, patient and eternal, absorbed story, relic, and echo with gentle, hypnotic cadence. Sailors' voices, imagined or recorded, mingled with thought, observation, and subtle awareness, bridging past and present. Shadows and light merged with wind and tide to create slow, reflective arcs of thought, history, and calm. Even distant sounds, the soft flap of canvas, a gull's wing, or gentle lapping of waves, folded into continuous rhythm of reflection and memory. Each breath, glance, and gentle movement merged with the ocean's quiet, creating hypnotic continuity between observer, ship, and past. Relics, metal, and tide remained in patient conversation with memory, holding story, consequence, and presence in gentle suspension. Beneath the tides, her story sleeps, but on the surface it still whispers. The river plate wound slowly through its wide estuary, holding the calm weight of history in its gentle currents. Ships moved quietly along its path, sails or steel reflecting sunlight, shadows mingling with water and memory. Fishermen cast nets in the early morning mist, unaware of the faint echoes of steel and fire beneath the serene surface. Each ripple carried whispers of distant battles, quiet traces of human courage, and the rhythm of tides that had borne both chase and surrender. Trees along the shore stood in patient observation, their leaves rustling softly, keeping time with wind and water. Even the soft cries of gulls seemed touched by memory, arcs of sound folding gently into the river's steady cadence. Old docks held shadows of footsteps past, sailors' boots pressing upon planks that had felt the weight of history long ago. Every detail, the curve of the bank, the shimmer of water, the distant horizon, reminded observers of presence, consequence, and quiet endurance. Local voices, children at play, and merchants speaking in the market all became part of the subtle rhythm of place and memory. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. Along the estuary, yachts and small craft drifted gently, their hulls cutting soft paths through silver water, shadows merging with the river's steady pulse. Locals paused to watch, feeling the flow, sensing the invisible past woven into calm present, and letting thought wander across waves and history. Currents carried light, shifting patterns across hull and water, tracing shapes that seemed almost familiar, yet always distant. Observers imagined the weight of ships, the gentle sway of masts, and the quiet tension of sailors waiting for command. Even the wind brushed softly across skin and hair, mingling scent, memory, and reflection into each gentle breath. The rhythm of tide and river became hypnotic, inviting slow attention, meditation, and calm reflection. Boats passed, leaving long ripples, as if each stroke of water carried fragments of steel, courage, and decisions once made. Every footstep along the shore seemed absorbed into the cadence of flowing water, light and quiet memory. Shadows of distant trees, clouds and sails reflected in water, merging past, present, and imagination into soft continuity. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. Monuments and plaques dotted the shoreline, their inscriptions soft, patient reminders of courage, presence, and the rhythm of time. Visitors traced words with fingertips or eyes, absorbing history in measured, contemplative awareness, mindful of distance, consequence, and humanity. Even the gentle sway of branches above, the murmuring of water, and the distant calls of birds seemed to hold a whisper of sailors' presence. Old mariners, retired and quiet, spoke softly to each other, sharing fragments of story, memory, and reflection, as if passing along rhythm with calm purpose. Each fragment of narrative, whether spoken or read, became a thread in the tapestry of remembrance, linking the river's calm to the distant Atlantic. Children's laughter carried softly across piers, unbroken by distance, folding into awareness like gentle waves reaching shore. Every ripple, footstep, or breath seemed to participate in quiet observation, shaping presence and thought in continuous meditation. Visitors lingered, absorbing shapes, lines, and reflections, letting mind drift through water, steel, and horizon in gentle arcs. Even the gentle lapping of water at hulls seemed like dialogue between past and present, rhythm and story. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. Dusk fell over the estuary, light softening into amber and violet, turning water into slow-moving glass. Boats rocked gently in calm eddies, their shadows long, merging with distant trees, piers, and horizons into hypnotic shapes. Fishermen pulled nets slowly, feeling time pass differently, measured in water, wind, and reflective thought. Even small currents held memory, carrying fragments of battles, decisions, and sailors' quiet courage across distance and imagination. Tourists paused at railings, eyes tracing lines of water, reflections, and the gentle rhythm of waves folding into shore. Every detail, the shimmer of ripples, the scent of salt and river mud, the soft wind brushing skin, invited presence and attention. Observers imagined sailors' hands, feet, and voices across time, weaving memory into gentle meditation on courage, consequence, and passage. Shadows stretched across river, pier, and boat alike, merging past and present, light and reflection, memory and meditation. Time itself seemed slow, patient, measured by water and wind, rather than clock or schedule. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. Distant voices drifted from shore and water. Conversations quiet, deliberate, measured with respect and reflection. Historians and guides spoke softly, recounting story, consequence, and honor without urgency, letting words fold gently into observation. Every ripple, gleam of steel, and curve of water seemed to hold quiet presence, linking imagination with history, thought with rhythm. Trees and docks remained still, guardians of memory, their roots reaching down to water, anchoring reflection, awareness, and calm. Fishermen's nets rose and fell slowly, mimicking pulse of river, movement of tides, and gentle cadence of long-past sailors. Even the scent of wet wood, salt, and fading sunlight mingled with observation, thought, and quiet meditation. Each visitor, passerby, and observer became part of rhythm, carrying reflection, presence, and awareness with soft, deliberate intent. Light shifted slowly as evening deepened, reflections shimmered, and memory threaded through river, horizon, and shore. The Atlantic had long carried echoes of chase and surrender. Here the river held them close, patient and unhurried. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. The estuary held quiet gatherings at small memorials, lanterns casting soft glow on plaques and engraved stone. Voices, subdued, narrated fragments of story, honor, and consequence, weaving reflection into the gentle rhythm of water and wind. Observers traced ripples, waves, and horizon, letting imagination connect to sailors' presence, decisions, and courage long ago. Even the gentle lapping against hulls, piers, and reeds seemed deliberate, thoughtful, a reflection of measured history and patient observation. Boats drifted slowly, their wake tracing arcs, like soft threads, stitching past to present, echo to reflection. Children's laughter mixed with older voices, layering curiosity and reverence into quiet meditation on the passage of time. Each ripple, breath, and whispered story became part of the hypnotic rhythm, grounding observation, memory, and presence. Shadows of masts, piers, and trees stretched across water in subtle patterns, creating a gentle map of light, thought, and reflection. Observers' minds traced sailors' movements, winds, and tides across decades, folding human presence into water's patient rhythm. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. The night deepened, sky and water blending into gentle shades of blue and silver, the horizon a soft, quiet line. Stars reflected faintly on calm water, ripples distorting light in slow, hypnotic motion, echoing distant steel, fire, and memory. Every sound, footsteps, oar, wind, water, became part of river's rhythm, measured, patient, reflective. Visitors lingered, silent, eyes tracing curves of water, shapes of boats, and faint lines of shadow across pier and bank. Even the gentle sway of reeds, the distant cry of gulls, and the soft murmur of conversation carried subtle reminders of presence and story. Historians and locals alike let thought drift across decades, folding story into calm meditation on consequence and honor. Time seemed suspended in rhythm with tide, current, and quiet observation, letting mind and heart rest in gentle reflection. Every ripple, glimmer of moonlight, and subtle movement of water wove together story, memory, and presence into one continuous hypnotic cadence. Even after the visitors left, the river held story, whispering it in ripples, wind, and quiet arcs across shore and horizon. The river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed. Morning light returned slowly, brushing the river with gold and pearl, softening every shadow and reflection. Boats drifted, sails catching the wind in gentle arcs, carrying fragments of story along quiet currents. Observers arrived to pause, reflect and imagine, tracing sailors' paths across waves, steel, and horizon. Even the smallest detail, a bend in the pier, a shimmer of water, a ripple across hull, carried meaning, memory, and quiet meditation. Fishermen, children, and historians alike merged attention with rhythm, letting thought move slowly with tide and wind. Each story remembered, spoken or imagined, wove seamlessly into presence, echo and reflection, threading calm into conscious awareness. Ripples, shadows, and currents folded memory into the landscape, river, and horizon, creating gentle, hypnotic arcs of meditation. The Atlantic had long told its tale through waves. Here the river preserved echoes, presence, and enduring calm. Every observer, whether distant or near, carried away part of story, honor, and reflection. Slow and deliberate, the river flows on, carrying with it the echoes of fire, steel, and the silence that followed.